Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to our November installment of the Armchair Admirals. Today we will be covering the night battles of Guadalcanal, specifically in November 1942, even though I guess we will have to cover what happened before and generally what happened after in the due course of the questions, because there's a lot of them around the wider context. With me there is Maconiel.
Hello, very happy to be there with you to discuss such thrilling naval battles, even though they had their
You're
fair share.
you're cutting a rather dazzling figure, even razzling.
Oh, yes. I hope it will reflect the actual confusion that reigned during the both of
Yes,
those battles.
that's probably going to be the case. And we have our three guests today. In no particular order, we have Drachinifel.
Hello.
We have Dr. Alexander Clarke.
Howdy.
And after a year and something, we are happy to welcome again Jake from the US Naval Institute.
How you doing?
Who already took part in the Armchair Admirals concerning the night battles of Guadalcanal once, the Savo Islands. So now we are back to the same topic. What are some interesting releases from USNI that are happening around now?
Well, I have to shamelessly plug Drax Edition to the world, Russian and Soviet battleships. This is pretty fantastic. A big thank you to Drachinifel and World Warships for helping us with this project. And then on topic is Battleship Commander about Admiral Willis Lee, who will come up a few different times, I assume, in our conversation this afternoon. That's been hugely popular the last couple of weeks. And again, Drac did a video a couple of weeks ago, and it's pretty fantastic. So give that a shot.
Yeah. Drac, any exciting news?
I'm working on a lot of different things at the moment. I suppose I can allow one small spoiler alert. I've been fortunate enough to be contacted by a gentleman who's, I believe, off the top of my head, I believe it's his father. It could be his grandfather, but I think it's his father. Was actually present at the Pearl Harbor attacks on December 7th, 1941. And has a bunch of copies of the signals that he was being asked to run around with in the middle of being bombed, strafed, and otherwise shot at by Japanese aircraft. So this coming month in December, I'm going to be, rather than revisiting, oh, look, guys, let's walk you through the Pearl Harbor attack, but step by step for the 50 billionth time, because I'm sure that's never been done. I'm going to instead try and work with him to tell the story of what it was like to be at the Pearl Harbor attack through the eyes of someone who was actually there.
That sounds definitely fascinating.
That's my spoiler alert coming forward.
Yeah. And Dr. Clarke?
Let's see, what am I doing right now? Crying a lot. No, no, seriously. I have Force Z Special, which we're doing as part of Bilge Pumps with Drachinifel and Jamie from Armored Carriers, which kind of fits with tonight's discussion. I was supposed to be working on my sloop book, but then I went to the Andrew Lambert event at King's College, where he launched his new book on Julian Corbett, which is a really cool book, and I dragged Drachinifel along, and we met a lot of people and had a lot of fun there. And I didn't really have to drag him. I said Andrew Lambert, and he was there before me. While there, I was chatting away with actually my publisher, who's also Andrew's publisher, and they basically went, actually, we prefer your carrier book from your PhD to come out first, we think. So I'm now switching book streams, and I'm just basically doing a lot of stuff and running around doing a lot of naval history and enjoying it. And still trying to get to 13,000 subscribers. So I can win bragging rights versus my aunt.
Oh yeah, the bragging rights and more important, the face mask, right?
The bragging rights are more important than the face mask. The bragging rights familial bragging rights are the key thing in life. Let's be honest. That's what you want.
True.
Familial bragging rights.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah. So today's topic is the night battles of Guadalcanal. So I will do a quick rundown because I had actually quite a lot of fun recently scheduling a Twitter storm covering these battles. And I did it already once in the past, but I tried to update it more from the Japanese side this time to have more details there. And it did help me actually to drive home some of the events that happened and that are often overlooked in the background of the two big night battles. So yeah, I still have some of the key facts in my brain. So let's go. So why did it all happen? Well, it all happened because there was this little tiny orange speck in the middle of nowhere, and in August 1942, basically things started happening there because the Allies decided to come out on the offensive on a limited scale, and because it was kind of middle of nowhere, far off from both sides' logistical chains, things were building up pretty slowly over August and September, at least on the ground. On the sea, there was one very big battle at the Savo Island, where the US cruisers suffered a lot. Then there was the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, where, well, basically it was a kind of sort of draw. And then there was the night battle of Cape Esperance, where the Japanese cruisers got beating. And then in October, there was another carrier battle that Japan won, but at quite steep cost, the Santa Cruz. And it all was about this little piece of real estate. The Henderson field started by the Japanese, finished by the Americans, and kind of the centerpiece to the action, as we will even see. Basically, whoever held the airfield controlled the waters around Guadalcanal during the day. So it generally evolved into Americans during the day and Japanese by the night, because at the same time the range of the planes was not enough to cover far enough. So with fast ships, you can get in and out basically during the night and avoid most of the airstrikes. Not so with slow transports, and that's where we are getting now. Because by the November, the Japanese High Command decided that they really need to take care of the situation, and to take care of the situation they needed a lot of men on the spot and a lot of heavy weapons, which they kind of lacked, because you can deliver soldiers there under the cover of darkness on destroyers, but you cannot deliver, for example, field artillery. For that you need transports. To get transports safely there, you need to neutralize the airfield. After Santa Cruz, both sides were kind of out of aircraft carriers. Japan was left with one not fully fleet carrier, the Junio, converted liner. Americans had not fully fleet carrier Enterprise without one elevator. So it was kind of equal chance, even though Enterprise still had advantage because of the bigger air group. Here's one of our nice little artworks for the Eastern Solomon, for the Santa Cruz. So both sides decided to try to run in some reinforcements. The American reinforcements got to the place actually earlier, November 11, November 12. The unloading of the transports was several times interrupted by airstrikes. The last one is shown here. The columns of smoke are actually coming from two wrecked planes. During the airstrikes, one transport was damaged, had to return, and USS San Francisco was damaged by a crashing plane. The secondary command station and aft anti-aircraft fire control stations were quite demolished. And then, during the night of the 12 to 13, there were reports of Japanese battleships incoming, and given that the only force in the area that could potentially try to stop them was the cruiser force that was escorting the transport, the cruisers had to try to stop the battleships. They didn't necessarily have to sink them, they just had to stop them from bombarding the airfield, because that was, again, the most critical piece of real estate, and earlier events in October showed that battleships can do a very, very serious damage already to the field. Not critical one, but if you combine 2 nights of bombardment, it's already getting somewhere. Result was a very confused night battle that is pretty well known and very well described in the Neptune's Inferno from the generally from the boards of the US ships. It's not an easy read because it was really not a pleasant place to be, but it's I really highly recommend reading the book because the accounts there are very gripping and give you a very good idea on what happened. Result of the damage was basically on the American side, only 2 ships out of the, what was it, 13? 15? Were left not damaged. The light cruiser Helena and the destroyer Fletcher. 1 more destroyer was fairly lightly damaged, the O'Bannon, but the rest of the ships got very heavy damage. 3 destroyers were sunk. Light cruiser Atlanta was sunk. Light cruiser Juno was sunk on the way back from the battle by a submarine. Heavy cruiser Portland got its stern kind of almost blown off by a torpedo, and San Francisco almost burned down. So very heavy losses. On the Japanese side, however, battleship Hiei lost steering and had to... Oh yeah, here's the damage to the Portland. Battleship Hiei lost steering and had to kind of sort of stay in the area and was subjected to a lot of airstrikes on the following day and eventually had to be abandoned and sunk. I think we will get to it, but in part it showed how resilient actually the battleships were because she suffered a lot of torpedo hits, a lot of bomb hits, and still lasted for most of the day, even though not really combat capable anymore. While mentioning USS Juno, this is also a very well-known tragic story. Those are the 5 brothers Sullivans who served on board of Juno. According to the survivors' testimony, 3 of them died instantly in the explosion that followed the torpedo hit. 2 survived and got in the water, but neither of them made it when, after I think 3 days, the 10 last survivors were picked up by rescue planes. So that kind of sums up the intensity of the battle and the cost to the US Navy. After the night battle, there was another bombardment by heavy cruisers, which was moderately successful, but the cruisers got delayed in the waters around Guadalcanal and did not make it out of the range of the planes in time. They got caught on the 14th, and 1 heavy cruiser, the Kinugasa, was sunk. The rest were damaged with various shades of... with various degrees of damage. And moreover, from the 11 ships from the cargo convoy, all but 4 were either sunk or turned back. So this day is probably the most important day for the strategic outcome of the battle, but it's often overlooked because it was kind of a one-sided air-to-sea battle, while the night battles were obviously more gripping. But yeah, personally, I think this day was very important because after all, the main goal of the Japanese operation was getting the reinforcements to the Guadalcanal. And then there was the night battle of the 15th, when the volunteer attack force... what was the full name of the force? It was something bombardment / volunteer attack force, composed from battleship Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and several destroyers, was to try to silence the Henderson field again. With nothing else to use, the US Navy had to deploy the 2 modern battleships, the Washington and South Dakota, and 4 destroyers. They didn't really want to do that because, I mean, that was really the last reserve they could use, and using them in the restricted waters around the Guadalcanal and with the known threat of the torpedoes was not really something they took lightly, but there was no other choice. In the end,
Not attaching them from Enterprise.
Yes. And basically, because the heavy escorts of the Enterprise were sent to Guadalcanal, Enterprise herself had to retreat south out of the danger because she was left with, I believe, one heavy and one light cruiser or something like that. So,
And just 26 planes, if I remember correctly.
yeah, it's, part of her air group was already on Guadalcanal, so that's... But in the end, it worked, even though the American destroyers again suffered heavily. The two were lost outright, two survived, but one had to be abandoned after the battle. And battleship South Dakota also suffered quite a serious beating, even though she was not really in the under threat of sinking, but she took a lot of damage. But that all gave space to the flagship, to the USS Washington, to get in close and open fire at some 8,000 yards against Kirishima, which I think this gives a good example of how confusing the night battles were, because if a battleship can creep up on you to like 8 kilometers, that's doesn't speak of too much visibility. You can see on this picture also that the guns are almost horizontal. It was really for battleship a point-blank range. Here's the basic map of that engagement, but on the end of the engagement, there were the US Navy lost 3 destroyers, Japanese Navy lost 1 destroyer, but also the second battleship in 3 days. So the remaining 4 transports made it to the Guadalcanal. The commander of the transport convoy knew that they have no chance of coming back, so they were beached to at least save some of the cargo. But during the day, they were heavily bombed. Here you can see the result, and they were all sunk. And that would be it, because after that, the Japanese Navy didn't really have stamina to run more large operations, especially since they ran out of transport ships to do so. So Guadalcanal was dependent on destroyer transport runs. At the end of November, one of those transport runs was to be interrupted by the US Navy Task Force. Here we can see the Task Force 67 from the board of USS Fletcher. Theoretically, it was a very, very unfair fight, because it was 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light, and several destroyers against 8 destroyers. Unfortunately for the American task force, the lessons from the previous night battles didn't fully filter through yet, because it was not even 2 weeks. So the tactics chosen were not ideal, and we will definitely touch the problems in the discussion. So suffice to say that in the battle, Japanese lost only 1 destroyer, and in turn their torpedo attack managed to sink 1 heavy cruiser and cause serious damage to 3 others. This is the USS Minneapolis, which lost part of its bow. This is USS New Orleans, which lost its bow up to the 2nd turret, which was very, very serious damage. She had to get a fake bow to even get to shipyard, and she had to dismount the guns from the number 2 turret. And USS Pensacola got also torpedo hit in the machinery spaces, so that was also quite serious damage. And that was the last major surface action around Guadalcanal, and for about half a year last major surface action in the Solomons, because after this both sides were kind of spent. So this was a very quick summary. Any comments from anyone so far? What did I get wrong?
Well, it's one of those, you got a lot right, so don't worry about that one too much. But what I would say is one of the interesting things about when I'm looking at Guadalcanal, and one of the things which I often bring up in Solomon Islands campaigns, is that it's very, very reminiscent of two sort of areas. One, it's a lot of the battles and a lot of the challenges you hear about and look at are very similar to the Mediterranean, in that it's conducting operations at night to get out of aircraft range in the day. So you're having to dive in, dive out using fast ships. You're having to think about that and think that through. You've got your aircraft carrier very close to the action, and you're constantly having to think, hang on, do we detach these escorts to go and do the fighting, or do we keep the carrier with them? E.g., you can go to Matapan and you can talk about, well, HMS Formidable gets ordered out of line after firing her 4-inch guns at the 4.5-inch guns at the Italian cruisers when she was supposed to not still be there. Cunningham had given her an order to go away, but she stayed there. Enterprise, well, you can almost suggest that the American admirals look at Enterprise and go, you're just going to copy the British armor carriers, aren't you? We're going to order you away long before you get anywhere near them, because you will try and get into gun range. There are just some ships which like that. But the other thing you have to remember about Guadalcanal, and one of the interesting questions which we had come in the question is why were they fighting there? Because when you look at Guadalcanal, there's no reason. It's not valuable in and of itself.
Is this a place for the map?
It's a crossroads. Yes, please, the map. It's a crossroads. If you think about it, there is Japan. The map's over there on this. So you can see Japan sort of at the top. Hawaii is in the opposite corner from Japan, really. And then there's Australia down below. So if you want to go from Hawaii to Australia, you're not going to go far from you're going to go past Guadalcanal. That's one of the quickest routes if you're doing that supply route for the Allies. If you're Japan and you want to block off supplies, you want to go to Guadalcanal because that allows you to operate in that area and block off supplies. It allows you to have that important air base. It allows you to have aircraft. You can all imagine where aircraft based on Guadalcanal could operate for if you were the Japanese. But it's also about supplying Papua New Guinea. It's also about supplying in the island hopping campaign. All these things. Guadalcanal is one of those places you're not going to for Guadalcanal. You're going to because you want to go elsewhere. And crossroad fights often turn into the most vicious fights. Just ask the Balkans. Just ask.
Yes.
We can all think of places through history, which in themselves, they're important to the people who live there. But to the big powers around them, they're important as places to go through to get to the other big power. And if you have control of it, you have access to that. So you tend to fight over it, which tends to be these areas get fought over very nastily and a lot. And this is what happens to Guadalcanal at the beginning of World War II, in the Pacific. It is a place which you are fighting over, not because you want Guadalcanal, but because you want to go somewhere from Guadalcanal, or you want to be able to go past Guadalcanal. It's why the US Navy is building an air base there in the first place. It's why the Army's quite shocked to going, why are you building one there? Well, the Navy's going, well, it's quite simple. It's to protect our convoy routes. It's because we've managed to lose quite a lot of our carriers and they've all been damaged, so we need air bases, and this would allow us to protect a large swathe of critical area for our convoy routes. It's useful from that perspective. It's not really, though, near anywhere itself that it'd be useful for. It's just useful for going through and going past, and it's the spot in the map that you can use.
Yep. That's probably the best definition of crossroads. That's also basically how it happened that both sides started fighting so far from their normal logistical chains, because the Allies were focusing on supplying Australia, Japanese on the push to Papua New Guinea, and potentially maybe sometime in the future for the push against the Fiji and Samoa, but that was kind of still up in the air. So nobody really initially planned to fight there, and
it shows in the forces that are dispatched. Because if you look at them, you're sitting there going, well, these aren't really... These are what the Americans have available, and they're what the Japanese have available. But if it was a major thrust, you would expect the Japanese to turn up with far more significant forces at the beginning, and you'd almost expect the Americans to be turning up with more significant forces at the beginning. It's sort of an attack which develops. It's a battle which develops, and it's what is available, let's pull it in. Neither side has really been thinking about this battle long-term, thinking it's coming, we've got to make sure we have resource in the area. It's a case of, oh, fudge, we've got a battle going on here. Oh, fudge, the other side has come to the same conclusion we have. Oh, fudge, we better send what we can find, what's available. Open the store cupboard. What do we have? Thankfully, in that store cupboard, you had Admiral Ching Lee. Thankfully, because, frankly, he's one of the more sensible commanders you have down there, so if the Japanese had been able to find its equivalent number down there, they would have probably been able to cause the Americans a lot of trouble. But it's one of those scenarios that there's the various troops on the ground who are fighting, and you're looking at them going, the Americans lucked out in their commanders there, but if you look at them, they're mostly the units which they didn't think they were going to luck out with using. Most of the ground forces which end up in Guadalcanal are the ones which they thought they were still needing to train up, or the commanders, they weren't quite sure. They might be too aggressive. They're not quite the right sort. They may not have quite the right country club membership. We can all think of those remarks. If as anyone who's ever read archives and history documents, you've all seen the way that sometimes these phrases sort of, they're not said, but they're unspoken part of critiques. And you look at the commanders which turn up in Guadalcanal, and a lot of the ground forces commanders fit that category, and they do really well, I would argue, because of it. Because instead of getting down to each other and trying to have a bromance with each other, they sit there and go, like then, let's go kick them.
I mean, you mentioned, Admiral Lee, sort of in the cupboard that way. Does he have a Japanese counterpart? I don't think so. I mean, if you look at what happens, especially at Savo Island, the Japanese turn around then. They have the advantage after the night battle on the 13th. They turn around then. Where are the Japanese commanders that really, push their advantage, and accomplish the mission? They're all sort of stuck in this doctrine that they've been working on for 10 plus years, and I don't know. I don't see it. So to your point, the fact that Lee is there, does he and Washington, win the day and win the entire campaign in that one little bit, it's an interesting idea.
And to be honest, even if the Japanese did have an admiral, the equivalent of Admiral Lee, they probably would have exiled him to some remote part of their empire after the second night action of Guadalcanal, purely because he didn't come away completely spotless, because a few of the ships got damaged. Because that's one of the major operational disadvantages the Japanese Navy has at this point. Strangely enough, the admirals who actually do better end up being more harshly punished and reassigned than the ones who failed completely.
I mean, I can see a parallel actually between the second night action and the Savo Island from the Japanese side, because I mean, the Washington Whitley also had a pretty good idea that somewhere out there in front of him there are still the transports and they should be dealt with, but he also didn't push this because I mean, he was aware of the danger. He didn't know where the rest of his task force is. He knew that he lost somewhere one battleship and he needs to find her, which happened only in the morning the next day because the South Dakota was completely incommunicado because basically all the communication equipment was heavily damaged. So I would see parallel here between Lee's decision-making process and Mikawa's decision-making process after Savo. Because Mikawa was back then also very much aware that basically his heavy cruisers are the only thing that the Japanese Navy has in the area, and that if they want to try to have any counterattack on Guadalcanal, these ships will be needed for escorting convoys and stuff. So I wouldn't really be that harsh on him for not pushing forward back at Savo. But after that, I don't really know. Like Abe got kind of handed the raw deal because on the first night action, that battle was a complete horrible, utter mess where none of the commanders on either side knew what's happening, who is where, which ships are even hostile. Because actually, while the Callahan's order to ceasefire is well known, the Japanese had the same issues, and Abe was also trying to get his ships under some sort of control, and also was worried that they are firing at friendly ships, which they might have been. We will probably never know because a lot of the records got lost when the ships were sunk later in the war. So he got handed pretty raw deal, and plus he kind of made Yamamoto angry afterwards when he didn't want to sacrifice Hiei's crew to serve as bomb magnet, but that's another thing. And Kondo, I actually don't know what was his career after Guadalcanal 2, but
He was still around for a while.
Yeah.
But I mean, to be honest, the first night action of the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, it does show kind of the starting point of where the USN is, and actually Admiral Lee's later career after the Guadalcanal campaign shows how they adapted, because a good chunk of why the first night action went as badly as it did for most of the US Navy ships was because basically Callahan had been put in charge. He didn't really have much idea about what he was doing in a night action. Admiral Scott, who he'd actually been present for 2 night actions. He'd been a frustrated observer at Savo Island, and of course had led Cape Esperance. He had a much better idea about how to fight the Japanese in a night action, but he was relegated to second in command purely because Callahan had the barest sliver of seniority over him. So at this point, the US Navy was still stuck very much in the mindset of this guy was made an admiral literally weeks before this other guy, therefore he is in charge, regardless of actual, operational qualifications. Whereas just over a year down the line, when Admiral Lee is commanding the fast battleships in escort to Admiral Mitcher's carriers, Lee is actually significantly more senior than Mitcher by several years, but Mitcher is placed in overall command of the task force because the task force is centered around the carriers, and they realize that, well, if you're going to center everything around the carriers, you should probably have the carrier admiral in charge. And also, to be honest, both Mitcher and Lee were very good admirals, and they actually got on together without the inevitable clash that you might have with some admirals over seniority. But it does show kind of the difference that was made by a year or so of operational experience. But unfortunately, by the time of the first night action of Guadalcanal, they hadn't got that level of operational experience, and so you ended up with all sorts of little details going wrong. I mean, as you say, you've got Callahan's order not to fire, you've got the fact that USS Fletcher has probably the most advanced radar set in that detachment of the US fleet, and is stuck at the back, where it can do nothing because all it can see is its own ships. San Francisco then shooting up the Atlanta probably didn't help either.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
And one of the points you have to think about with the with Lee, and this should be come up with the whole thing with especially Mitchell later in the war. In this book, which is Task Force 58, which is a new one by Rod McDonald, it's a C4 book. I've got the version of UK. I'm not sure if it's also USNI.
Yep,
I think
it is.
You have a USNI version as well.
Mhm.
It's excellent, by the way. I've done a review on my channel. It's very good. But Lee is the non-carrier admiral mentioned the most, because pretty much all the carrier admirals actually respected him, listened to him, and if he had said to them, even if he was a second in command because he was in charge of battleships, they were in charge of carriers, hang on, I think the battleship should do this. Most of them would have gone, that's fine, we'll let we will bow to your experience. Because even if we're in charge, you know your battleships well. They respected him as a professional. some of the battleship admirals, and the USA has the same problem that the Royal Navy has, that all the large navies have, and the Japanese have this as well, that you need a lot of admirals to administer a large navies. You have to have a lot of senior people because they come up through. The trouble is, some admirals can make a transition from peacetime to wartime, and some admirals who you think on paper will make the transition well, don't. And some who you don't think are going to make the transition well turn out to make it really well. And then you're also faced with the joy of actually having to promote to fix the problems and how you're going to deal with the problems and how you're going to manage it. The Royal Navy, of course, most famously had Lord Cork and Ori come back from Norway and muck up Norway. But I can spend a week being rude about Lord Cork and Ori, so we'll leave that to one side. But the point is, Lee's a good admiral, and therefore he's respected by the good admirals. Usually you find when people do start insisting on, I have seniority, that is your first example of, okay, you're not going to be a good admiral. Because it's kind of like if you're working in an office and someone turns around and says their answer to a reason of why you shouldn't do something some ways, I've been here longer than you. That's not a logical argument for why we shouldn't do it that way. That's a logical argument that you've been in that post for longer. Is your general copy?
It's I guess the modern way of summing that up is the man who says I am the king is no true king.
Yes.
If you need to tell people you're God, you're not God.
Yeah. Maconiel, you wanted to say something?
Well, yes, as we are talking about admirals and people in command, there was one question about from Hetman Mazeppa, who was wondering how much was the change for the USN when they changed from Gormley to Hasley, and how did it affect the campaign in Guadalcanal?
I'm trying to find a question.
How much did the change actually affect the campaign overall from Gormley to Hasley?
Oh, yes. Okay, yes. So that was a fairly major change. Admiral Gormley was effectively removed by Nimitz and replaced with Halsey, because, and again, that simple action, when you know a bit more of the background about Nimitz, shows you just how serious the situation had gotten, because Nimitz was rarely, if ever, one to try and take a direct hand in a specific campaign. As far as he was concerned, he managed the entire theatre, he chose admirals, he gave them ships, he sent them off, and he said, do this mission, and he left them to it to a certain degree. But Gormley, for various reasons, was acting in a fairly timid fashion. He was reacting to what the Japanese were doing, which is never a good place to find yourself in. And Nimitz had already kind of broken his rule of not directly interfering several times by effectively trying to encourage Gormley to take some more offensive action without directly telling him, oi, buck up and go out and shoot something. But
you can almost say Nimitz was trying to almost be British in his approach of being passive-aggressively going, are you sure you don't want to do something today? Are you sure you don't have enough fuel to do something today? Do you not have enough spares to fix those ships?
Yeah, but then when the problem was, Gormley was either coming up with excuses, which Nimitz knew weren't valid because he was getting reports from other people in the theatre, or doing the next best thing to outright refusing Nimitz's orders. He couldn't obviously outright refuse because Nimitz was his superior officer, but he was very good at coming up with lots of plausible sounding excuses as to why he couldn't do certain things. And morale was suffering. They weren't getting results. And as a result, Nimitz decided that he needed someone in the theatre who was a lot more aggressive. And, it's not entirely a negative reflection on Admiral Gormley. He did have some redeeming qualities, but when you look into the context, it seems, apart from anything else, he was just completely strung out, under stress, and had basically reached a point we would today, I guess, call burnout. And yes. he was just mentally, his wheels were spinning in the mud. He just wasn't able to comprehend how to take this further forward. And you can see that in that, Nimitz didn't want that command style to continue. He relieves him, puts Halsey in place. But unlike some admirals, such as Carlton Wright at Tassafaronga, Gormley does go on to give some fairly useful service later on, once he's been given a chance to recover, even though he's not let into that kind of front line campaign role anymore. And then Halsey comes in, and of course Halsey just wants to go out and, strangle things, shoot things, and kick them while they're down, preferably all at the same time. So he's pushing for very, very aggressive action. Obviously, the Battle of Santa Cruz doesn't necessarily work out entirely brilliantly for the US Navy, because they lose another one of their precious carriers. But it does have a lot of interesting effects, because whilst the Japanese on paper have a superiority after Santa Cruz in terms of how many actual carriers they have afloat and able to fight in the front lines, the simple fact that Halsey has forced the action has forced the Japanese to confront a US Navy that's very rapidly developing its AA doctrine, in no small part thanks to USS Enterprise's weapons officer, who at one point is advocating removing all side armor plating from the ship in order to lighten the ship so that he can put more 20mm guns on it. And you can detect a distinct note of annoyance in one of his reports when he notes that all available deck space not currently used for flight operations has now been covered in 20mm guns, and he's trying to find additional space somewhere to put more anti-aircraft guns, which has the rather worrying effect from the Japanese side of basically ripping half of their planes out of the sky, which means that although they have more carriers leaving that fight than the US Navy does, they have significantly less planes and significantly less pilots, without which the carriers are not exactly that useful. So from that sort of changeover point, there's still a lot to learn. There's still a lot of losses to come. There's still tactical defeats like Tassafaronga to come. But Halsey's general leadership means that these battles are happening at all. And whilst you do get to a point where actually both sides are incredibly strung out, I mean, you don't really send Kirishima in the night after the first night of Guadalcanal unless you're absolutely desperate. And similarly, you don't send in the 4 destroyers that happen to have the most fuel in their bunkers, even though they've never operated together, unless you're really desperate. But Nimitz has the understanding that, even if both sides end up completely exhausting themselves by the end of the year at Guadalcanal, the US Navy has a lot more ships in production and in repair than Japan does. So in the cold hard math, Halsey and Nimitz comprehend that they can afford the grind to a certain extent, as long as they don't have any massive losses, and the Japanese can't. And that eventually obviously proves to be true.
Yes, that's basically also one of the impacts of the Santa Cruz, that while it was technically Japanese victory, basically effectively Japan lost a carrier division there, because they lost basically, I would say, what amounted to more than one full carrier air group in the battle. There are testimonies of the officers on Junio, describing how basically all planes that returned were damaged to some extent, and the crews were positively shell-shocked because they never encountered such a terrible AA fire before. So basically the end result was that while in the short time frame of a few weeks, Japanese had 1 carrier in space and Americans had none, after these few weeks, when Enterprise was quickly patched, suddenly US Navy still had a fleet carrier and Japan did not. So that's why also Junio couldn't really take any more decisive action during the November battles, because basically all she could do was stand off and send fighters over whatever needed fighter cover at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, they went into that battle with, 4 flight decks worth of aircraft of different sizes. By the time that battle was over, the sum total of all Japanese Navy strike aircraft available in the region could fit onto Shikaku with room to spare. Everything else was basically, it had either been shot down or had, once they'd landed, they just looked at it and gone, well, unless we want a particularly interestingly shaped colander, this is of no further use to us, and shoved it off the side.
I have here. Yeah, sorry.
One thing quickly. Someone has just commented quite correctly in the YouTube chat that not a single one of us is actually in an armchair.
That's
My
true.
chair has arms.
My chair has armrests as well, but none one of us are in as an armchair.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
It's an oversight. Yeah.
It's an oversight. We actually started this setup with me in the armchair over there, but since we changed the setup a bit so that, and since I got the training to operate the streaming setup by myself, we generally don't have armchair. Yeah. There is a question from producer from JIS6 Stern that Jack picked for his question. One of his questions: how did USS Helena survive this engagement? I guess that's for Guadalcanal 1. So,
so exactly. So in the first night battle, yeah. So how did Helena survive that? Well, so Helena is recently newer. She has probably the best radar and out of the ships there, or at least is most proficient at using it. She actually spots the Japanese first, and if you have a competent radar man or group or the crew, a lot of it's probably just luck with all the amount of torpedoes and shells going off all the way around. But if you can correctly identify ships and move around in the night, it doesn't surprise me that the two ships that survived, Helena and Fletcher, the ones with the best radar, are the ones that that get away. Just crew training and then intuition and keep adjusting course and speed. That's a good torpedo avoidance strategy for a real life and in game.
You see,
Yeah.
I have often put forward for the US Navy that they have an advantage in not having as much of a worked up night fighting doctrine as the Royal Navy and the IJN do going into World War II. Now, the reason the USN hadn't developed it is if you look at the different navies, reason why they're going for it. Night fighting is a very high risk strategy. As the first battle show of Guadalcanal, it's a complete mess. It can be a tremendous problem, and you can end up shooting yourself as much as you shoot the enemy. The British go for it because they presume that in the beginning stages of any war, they are going to be outnumbered in the locality until they can get the most of their fleet there, because of the realities of the empire they're protecting, which spans the whole world. The Japanese presume they're going to be fighting either the Americans or the Brits, or maybe both, so they'll be fighting massively outnumbered. So therefore, the risk of night fighting is justified based on that requirement to try and whittle down the forces. But they don't really go for night flying for the reason that that's incredibly, that can cause an attrition rate in your own skilled pilots, and it's difficult enough to get them as it is. Whereas the British do go for night flying because the British go, well, we're going to be really, really outnumbered where we are in the world until we can get reinforcements. And that's as long as we aren't fighting everyone across the entire world, then we're going to be outnumbered wherever we are. So we better still be able to do night flying. The US Navy doesn't do that because their thinking is we're going to have superiority in the day because we're going to outnumber our opponents. So why risk the night battle where we could end up shooting ourselves or not being able to fully engage our forces? Instead, hold the fleet back, use speed, and then engage during the day, which is a very sensible, very logical approach. It's not wrong. It's basically one of those things. Is one size. There isn't one answer to every single problem, or it's sort of not. The problem doesn't always have the same answer for different navies. But this also means when you're dealing with these night battles in Guadalcanal, a lot of the commanders are able to adapt and improvise and produce their own doctrine on the fly, which suits their ships, which suits their crews. And when we're looking at the Helena, when we're looking at the Fletcher, we're looking at two very well worked up crews, which have a lot of trust going up and down the chain of command. They have a very good leadership. They have a very responsible leadership. They have well drilled chiefs. They have well drilled junior officers, they have senior officers who aren't going to micromanage, they have sailors who know what they're doing and are highly motivated, and it's no surprise that they get the best out of them, because basically the doctrine for night fighting is whatever the captains of those ships feel like making the doctrine, and that means they can adapt to the skill set of their officers and their sailors. So if they have good radar people, they use that radar, and which admiral can then call them up and go, "Oh, you're not doing the right thing. You're not following the doctrine," because there is no doctrine. So they can do what they like. It's if you consider it's the complete opposite of what most modern navies are dealing with these days. If you're a captain of a ship, because there's a doctrine for pretty much everything to tell you how you should and what you should do. And yes, that doctrine is usually hard fought through and worked through and all these things, but it means your hands are in a way tied, because you always have to justify yourself as, if you're not doing that doctrine, why are you not doing it? And when there is no doctrine and you trust your crew, well, you can do what you like. You can just go, well, I was reacting to the situation, sir, and I survived. My ship survived, didn't it?
Yeah, I will actually.
No one can critique you.
Yeah, I would actually drop here this, because we are talking a lot about radar and about doctrine and stuff, but as you mentioned, there was basically no doctrine back then. The first radars that basically anyone had were using the so-called A scope, which is basically this. So what this thing gives you is range to target within some like narrow angle, and the only way you can use this thing to search for targets and to get idea about what's happening around you, the operator has to basically manually sweep the antenna around. When he gets a hard target, he has to lock down the camera, note the bearing, measure the distance, and only then he can continue to again measure. That's probably why a lot of the American commanders did not really trust the radar especially after Savo, because before the Savo Island it was seen as kind of a miracle night fighting tool. Then it completely failed to detect the Japanese force coming in or help in any way. And while some admirals decided, hey, okay, that might be because we used it wrong and we have to figure out how to use it, the others were like, okay, so this is a good tool maybe for gunnery, but we can't really use it for much else. Which is
this is the thing. You have to remember, it's before the plan position indicator comes in, and it's before people start working out, hang on, what happens if we connect radar to the same system we use for beacons?
Yes, and
or the beacons on carriers, and get the radar going round and start working it through. So this is the very early version of the radar, so it requires a lot more skill. It's kind of the difference between a longbow and a musket.
Yes,
the other thing with these radars that you've got to remember is that actually a good chunk of radar's issue when it came to operating the Guadalcanal area generally is Guadalcanal itself and Savo Island. You know, radar, even like this, is absolutely perfect if you're out in the middle of the ocean, because the only return you're going to get is from a socking great lump of metal that's coming to try and kill you. That's great. But unfortunately, when you're close in to Guadalcanal and Savo, you get all sorts of interesting, fun returns off of rocks and mountains and cliffs and all other sorts of interesting things, many of which can look very similar to battleships and cruisers and so forth. And because it's all just little peaks on a line, you'd have no idea immediately what they may or may not be. And so in a lot of the earlier engagements, people technically could see the Japanese coming, but they didn't know they were the Japanese. They just knew there was a bunch of squiggly lines on a scope, most of which had been there all night. And to be fair, even once the plotting position indicator, which is kind of what everyone thinks of as a radar scope, comes in, well, to be honest, we were still having problems with rocks getting in the way of the radar telling you what was there all the way up to the Falklands War and beyond. So it wasn't exactly, I mean, yeah, it was something that you could overcome, but it wasn't something that was overcome as a general technological point, even 40, 50 years after World War II was concluded. Although, again, I do have to point out that it was something that Admiral Lee, in his infinite wisdom, because he actually knew what he was on about, had mostly overcome in his own ship, because unlike basically every other US commander in the area, he took one look at the operational theatre and went, oh, right, rocks, islands. I actually bothered to learn how radar works. I know this could be a problem. And he took his ships to operate off of Guadalcanal and Savo Island several days before the night battle of Guadalcanal, and made sure his radar operators knew how to tell the difference between the returns from a cliff and a mountain and a ship. So that meant that when it came to the second night action of the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, whilst Washington's crew couldn't initially tell was this South Dakota or was this Kirishima, what they did know was it was a ship.
Yes.
So they were keeping a very close eye out, and so they could get some kind of secondary indicator of what ship it actually was. At which point the Japanese were very, very helpful in that they opened fire on South Dakota and lit off a bunch of searchlights. At which point they already had all the range and bearing data, and they should go, right, well, I guess that's Kirishima. Time to load some Mark 8s.
Yes.
And if you want a good book on radar, this is one of the ones which actually it's an Air Force focused one. I have to admit, it's on the feet of the Luftwaffe and Battle Britain, but it has it has several good chapters on the technology, and it's Radar by David Zimmerman, and it's Radar on the feet of the Luftwaffe by David Zimmerman, and it has quite a lot of stuff about the technology, and including the difficulties of transposing land-based radar to naval-based radar, and why it was so difficult. You can't just use one set and put it on a ship, because you find saltwater does nasty things to it.
If you want to go and pick up a copy of Battleship Commander, which I know we mentioned earlier, you'll find all sorts of interesting details in there because, as you might guess, I rather like Admiral Lee, and from an engineer's perspective, he's kind of my perfect admiral, because not only is he very, very good at tactics, not only is he actually a genuinely good human being, which is incredibly difficult to find, surprisingly enough, in admirals who can fight very well, but he actually understands all the technology to a point that he actually understands it better than the people who are operating it. In the run-up to these battles, he's literally sitting down with the radar operators on Washington, telling them how the radar should work. And he's also doing the same with the gunnery crew. He actually ends up talking to technically someone who's slightly subordinate to the senior gunnery officer, because the senior gunnery officer doesn't understand gunnery and the technology involved to quite the same degree as his subordinate, and his subordinate can barely keep up with Admiral Lee. So the Japanese really lucked out when Washington showed up, because if there was one person you didn't want to face in a gun duel, it was Lee.
Yeah, that's actually, that was also important, because I was recently reading, I don't have the book here because I have it in electronic form, but Learning War, which is quite a very interesting dive into the development of the US Navy doctrine, especially for surface fight over the war. And there are some also interesting observations that actually helped to explain to me a lot of what was happening in the Solomons in 1942, 1943. And it has, again, to do a lot with the radar and with the operators not really being that experienced with it yet, because it was all about, again, this A-scope, which was used for fire control radars basically until mid-1943. And I mean, for the ships that didn't get to switch over to new sets until the end of the war. So what happened here is, okay, the basic situation is simple. You have a target, you have the signal, you lock your beam on the target, so you have the good resolution there. You start firing. Now what happens? You start getting water splashes all around the target, so they kind of obscure the target. So what typically did happen for the crews that didn't know how to filter this out, which Lee made sure that the Washington's crews did know, what happened is that usually first target to get hit got hit hard, but after that, all the following targets generally got lost in the splashes, especially since the crews were trained to fire basically as fast as they could reload, so there were no distinct salvos to keep track of after the first few salvos. And if the target ship tried to evade, which their captains generally would try to do when they are under fire, the radar operators would generally keep tracking the shell splashes. So subsequently, the ship would fire at her own shell splashes until somebody decided to cease fire, and then the target disappeared. So, hey, we sank something. So this is also an aspect of where basically learning how to use radar played a big role. Later in the war, there was the Type B scope introduced, which was basically vast improvement on the Type A because it didn't just give you squiggly line, but it gave you actually a top-down view on the target, kind of. So you can see, okay, this is target, those are my shell splashes, I should keep tracking the target. Obviously, it wasn't foolproof, but it generally worked better than the previous sight. But that's also the thing. We mentioned the Helena, the Fletcher, and I believe the O'Bannon in the Guadalcanal one. So basically, the 3 ships that got out with the least damage all had the newest SG radar set, which had this PPI scope that was already mentioned by Dr. Clarke. So this is already a huge improvement in the sense of giving your commanding officer a good overview, because here you can actually see the map. You can see where the targets are. If there are multiple targets, you can see them all at the same time. So this is a huge improvement. And in case of the USS Fletcher, it was even made better by her commander and her executive officer working out some new interesting concepts that later turned into the Combat Information Center. So basically to lessen the load on the captain, the cognitive load, because like running all this mental arithmetics in the middle of night battle was, as it turned out, pretty impossible for everyone. Basically, the executive officer took part of the things. He stood by the radar, was making the mental image for himself, and was reporting to the captain basically only what the captain needed to know, and already basically processed information. So that's also one of the possible reasons why Fletcher got away scot-free, because basically the situational awareness of the captain was far better than basically any other commanders in that battle.
I mean, Helena also had the advantage of being a Brooklyn-class cruiser with an incredibly well-trained gun crew, which meant the moment anybody showed up in her gun range, she almost literally hosed them down with enough 6-inch shells that even if the explosions didn't kill you, you'd probably capsize from the additional weight of metal now stuck in your side. She consistently does this over multiple engagements, and her exploits, interestingly enough, along with a couple of other ships that find themselves in similar situations, actually contribute directly to the development of things like the Des Moines class and the Worcester class, because the US Navy looks at the results of actions like this and they see that things like, San Francisco, Portland, yes, they have heavier guns, but in a close range night action where you've got lots of targets popping up out of nowhere, left, right, and center, getting off a salvo every 20-30 seconds actually basically means you're incredibly vulnerable, because if you miss that one salvo, the chances are either your target will disappear or another target will show up and just hose you down. Whereas being able to respond to incoming fire very quickly actually meant a lot more than being able to respond with slightly larger shells. So that partly drives the development of the auto-firing 6-inch guns for the Worcester, but it's also cited in a lot of internal US Navy documents as one of the main driving forces behind going to the massive expense of developing the auto-loading 8-inch gun, because they want to try and combine the firepower of an 8-inch gun, which, to be fair to Helen, it's probably lucky she didn't directly run into Kirishima or Hiei, because the 8-inch gun could do damage even to those ships, but combine that with the rate of fire that you could get out of something like Helena, which would then mean that you wouldn't put millions and millions of dollars of investment into a nice big 8-inch heavy cruiser only to find it massacred by 3 or 4 destroyers that showed up and could just hose it down. Whereas at something like a Des Moines with the rapid fire guns could just exchange blows with pretty much anything, no matter how small and how rapid fire their own weapons were.
And the interesting thing is, this is something which isn't so much discovered at Guadalcanal. It's been to an extent acknowledged by different navies for a while at this point. The Japanese, it's featured in their destroyer design more than it has featured in their cruiser design, because their cruisers, they were going for as many 8-inch cruisers as they could get, because they wanted them in a way as battleship substitutes, because they didn't have as many battleships as the Americans. But if you look at the British with the Town class cruisers and the Crown colonies, and the whole idea behind the 666s and even the quadruple sixes, which they were originally trying to develop for Edinburgh and Belfast, the idea is literally to hose the enemy down with 6-inch shells. The idea is to be firing as many 6-inch shells in the direction as possible, because the whole thing is, if you've got enough shells heading towards the target, you're going to cause damage. And the thing is, if you're firing 8-inch shells and you can't match that number of shells, you might get a hit with a single 8-inch shell, but if I've hit you with a dozen 6-inch shells in that time, then you are probably no longer in a position where you are capable of fighting me, because there is a difference between being afloat and actually being viable to fight.
Yes.
Yeah.
You see this. You said you see this in the Atlantis too, because even though they're destroyer leaders and they're relatively unarmored and a lot of them sink, but the continuation and the development of that class all the way through the war, and including then to pretty much almost post-war, and then all the various iterations, and then design studies, and in game, with the 5-inch 54 equipped version, that almost became a reality as well. So so to your point, it's everyone was thinking along those same lines, and you would have gotten like Minotaur, for instance, if like the war hadn't have ended. So everyone was going that direction.
Yes.
And the British, of course, also had the Didos, and them the Atlantis are sort of more comparable, because they're also sort of doing this AA role. But they are. The whole point is, why do you go for a 5.25-inch gun? Surely that's not a cruiser gun. Well, just look at the volume of fire this thing can fire at you. That makes it a cruiser, because that's going to make anyone go, "Oh my lord, you are literally doing a firework display all round me. This is not nice." Speaking of someone who actually has had people aiming fireworks at his office.
Yeah, this is actually also probably a kind of a result of the, let's say, Mogami panic, I would say, when the Mogamis were built with 15 155s, which I have looked at the stats, and it's clear to me from the get-go that the 155s were never meant as a serious armament for the Mogamis, and that they really were designed for the up-arming to 8-inch, because their rate of fire was pretty abysmal compared to all other 6-inch or so boat cruisers that basically, while the Allied nations basically took it seriously and designed the ammunition hoists to really be able to supply the guns with required ammunition in time.
And mind you, those 666-inch turrets, I think, probably get the prize for most reused naval weapons in history.
Yes.
Because they take them off, they put them on the Mugamis, then they take them off the Mugamis and put them on Yamato, then they take them off Yamato and stick them on the Oyodas. And I'm pretty sure if the war had lasted another year or so, they probably would have taken them off the Oyoda and put it on something else.
I mean, the Japanese did this a lot. The twin turrets from Akagi and Kaga were, the twin 20-centimeter turrets were dismounted and then mounted on the Thai coastal defense ships. So it was like hand-me-down turrets all the way.
Weren't they mounted on the casemate on the side?
Maybe closer.
They had a couple of twin turrets either side of the middle flight deck as well.
Yes.
But
It was a kind of funny looking design. We have in the chat Mike Whitaker. Apparently his father was on board of the USS Washington during the Guadalcanal too. He says, I remember my father telling me that their mount was ordered to shoot star shells that night. The command's firing order was immediately followed by a cease-firing because they had fired 60 shells. And that's actually something that's also quite often lost in the Washington's account, that the Washington really made a very good use of basically the complete armament, because while the main guns were firing on Kirishima, the the 5 twin mounts on that side of the ship, secondary mounts, were actually not firing at one target. They were split into 3 groups, and one group was firing at Kirishima, one group was firing at something else, I believe Atago or generally, and one turret was firing star shells to basically silhouette the Kirishima, because the Washington was not relying only on radar, but basically combined radar and optical tracking. So that was really like a proof
Star
of
shells also blind the Japanese gunners.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
That's the thing. It's the same thing as it's used at Taranto and various other things. If you're firing star shell, if you're setting up lights, especially if you're setting them behind the enemy, so firing them so they go off behind the enemy, you blind them and silhouette them at exactly the same time. So you silhouette them for your guns, making your job a lot easier, and you make it them even much more difficult for them to actually look at CU.
The 5-inch battery had also, along with South Dakota's 5-inch battery, was responsible for mortally wounding the Iron Army earlier in the battle, Japanese destroyer.
Yes.
But again, it shows what you can do with a very well-trained crew, because Admiral Lee, just because he was really good at gunnery, didn't just obsess over the main battery. He made sure the entire gunnery complement of the ship knew their job. And it wasn't just that they'd split their fire, as you remember we mentioned the star shells, but the thing is, those star shells that were being fired, they didn't come at a direct order from the bridge. Initially, the guns was loaded with high explosive shells from having previously shot up Iron Army. The gun crews and the gun captains on their own realized the situation they were in and took proactive action in order to lessen the risk to Washington, as we said, by blinding the enemy gunners with star shell and WP rounds. And that was purely on their own initiative, and again, because they knew their job. They'd been well trained in how to do their job. They'd been trained how to think for themselves, and they also knew that the person in charge would much rather they took unilateral action to benefit the ship than strictly follow the letter of the law when it came to their orders. And that did an awful lot of good for Washington, because it came out of the battle with just one little hole in its CXAM radar dish, which looks a little bit comical. But afterwards, a lot of the officers talked about the fact that during the night they could hear an awful lot of very strange sounds going on during the battle, and no one could quite figure out at first what all of these things were. And it was only afterwards that they realized that all of those screams and whistles and bangs that had been sounding around them had actually been dozens upon dozens upon dozens of Japanese shells that had been passing within tens of yards of the ship, because there was an entire Japanese fleet out there that was firing back at them. But it was only thanks to these kinds of proactive measures by Washington's own crew, and it made just the right amount of difference between ending up like South Dakota or coming out virtually intact.
And speaking of South Dakota, we have here a question that was pinged by Jack again, but we also have a complimentary question in the chat from Hetman Mazepa. What was the nature of the catastrophic failure on the South Dakota in the second night battle? How did she come to be known as a bad luck ship? I would say I can start by the first instance of the bad luck that night, probably. South Dakota still had her planes on the catapults aft. So what happened with the first salvo of the main guns? Both planes were wrecked and started burning, which also kind of gave an aiming point. Luckily, the second salvo then blown them overboard, but I guess this constitutes as the first bit of the series of the bad luck in the battle. So what happened afterwards, Jake?
Well, sorry.
Well, then the third salvo then put the fire out on the stern. So I guess that's okay. But actually, when we talk about what happened during the engagement, so South Dakota, this is the lead ship in the class. It's relatively new. A lot of new classes have various issues, especially now as they're rushing these ships out into theater. I mean, Massachusetts didn't even have her sort of working up period. She went right over to the Mediterranean and trained on the way there. So this is a brand new ship, brand new class, various issues, and so she has electrical problems. The shocks of the main guns, sets off breakers. Then you have various electrical, we would call them gremlins, and so right in the middle of the action, then she loses power, and things are resetting. She loses the radar, the power to the guns, and the range finding equipment, and all that. And then so the guys in the turrets, they switch over to the manual optics that are hanging off each side of the guns. And well, it's the middle of the night, you can't see anything, except some really bad glare and what have you. You talk about, and then to add, I guess, further insult to injury, I guess one of the guys manning the breakers ties one of the breakers back closed for the radar and some of the gun equipment, and then that ultimately power surges most of the ship. And so yeah, it's generally not a good time for South Dakota. And in that time period, she's just taking hits from various different calibers, 14-8 and destroyer shells. And yeah, she's pretty well battered, and then just kind of drifts off and into the night. And then that's where sort of loses Washington. And again, so Admiral Lee's like, well, I don't know if that's just South Dakota out there or if that's Kirishima, but yeah, unfortunately not good. Luckily, South Dakota doesn't take any sort of major damage below the waterline or anything enough to put her in risk of sinking. But yeah, definitely not a good first outing for that ship.
And she gets actually, although being unlucky for all the battering that she's taking, she actually also gets very lucky in a certain sense, because initially Kirishima was loaded with Type 3 Sanshiki shells, the incendiary ones, which they're planning on using as bombardment rounds on Henderson Field. But it's fairly apparent from the damage reports that at some point during the engagement, they obviously expend the rounds they've got in the barrel and they get AP rounds up. There's been quite a lot of analysis done on one particular hit, which shows that a hit that's scored on her aft barbette is almost certainly from a 14-inch armor-piercing round. Now, okay, South Dakota's designed to resist 16-inch gunfire, but, as much as Washington is battering Kirishima at what's effectively point-blank range, South Dakota is between them, so she's at even closer range, and mathematically, that round has the potential to actually go through the barbette. Right. And if it goes through the barbette, the magazines are the next stop, which, I think we all know what happens when a magazine cooks off. But luckily, that round comes in over the aft deck, hits, I believe it's a hatch cover on its way across, so it is literally skimming the deck, hits this hatch cover, that sends it into a bit of a spin and starts to detach the armor-piercing head. And so what appears to happen is it basically slams either sideways or backwards into the barbette, already in the process of breaking up, rather than full-on with the armor-piercing cap front. And that results in this massive detonation. There's a big dent in the barbette, lots of exterior damage, but the barbette does its job and keeps the explosion out. Whereas, I mean, the barbettes on the South Dakota class are still pretty massively armoured, so it's still debatable, depending on what exactly the impact angle would have been, as to whether or not that would have actually done in for South Dakota. But you don't necessarily want to risk that. So she got very, very lucky in that respect, which I suppose counterbalances the fact that she was in that position in the first place. Although it wasn't the first instance of the ship being unlucky, because she'd actually gone out much earlier
and
run aground, on something that it had been there, but she went in, didn't hit anything, went into anchorage, loaded up on supplies, draft went slightly deeper, tide went slightly further out, so she's now riding slightly deeper in shallower water, went straight back over the place, which hadn't been a problem before, and ripped open her side on a rock.
She apparently also ran over a whale.
Apparently.
Yeah, although that did slightly less damage than the rock did.
And
Speaking-
Cody85 on YouTube also reminded that actually, speaking of South Dakota's bad luck, already in the Battle of Santa Cruz that we mentioned earlier, South Dakota's number 2 turret was hit by a Japanese bomb, which
Right.
actually didn't really do much damage, but it managed to seriously injure the captain, who was at that time just like looking out from the bridge. So that wasn't good. And the splinter damage to 2 of the guns in that turret was such that the ordnance recommended not firing them. So she was basically going into the battle -2 guns already. So
Right. I think there's
Com-
splinter damage to the barrels on, what was it, the second turret?
Yeah.
Drac, maybe, I believe. And then so yeah, they said don't fire or else, you risk blowing
Yeah.
up the gun. Yeah.
Although in a wonderful display of early War Bureau of Ordnance shenanigans, it took them about a day and a half and 4 separate answers to come up with their final decision, which I think South Dakota promptly ignored anyway.
yeah, I mean, if
speaking of the really lucky side of the South Dakota during that engagement, on the Japanese side, they apparently were not trying to aim underwater, even though the AP shells were like very optimized for this purpose. Do we have a reason for that?
Well, from what I understand is that even though a couple of the smaller ships identified South Dakota as a battleship, a lot of the thinking was that they were still heavy cruisers, right? And so that has to do with, potentially where you aim and, how you're shooting. And of course, at the ranges too, if you can't, if you're aiming from far away, the shells are plunging, and if you're aiming at the waterline, you might get below waterline hits. But if you're pretty much, flat trajectory shells, you're hitting that sort of upper belt area, superstructure. So yeah, it's very, that's perfectly reasonable to assume that you don't do any underwater damage.
yeah, basically,
close
you
range.
cannot press the guns that far. When you're talking about the big guns, you have to remember you are at spitball distance for battleship guns. There's only so far you can depress. Battleship guns by this point have been designed for long ranges, so most of them have been concentrating, and most of the navies have been concentrating on trying to on increasing their ability of elevation, not on.
Depression.
Right then, well, they're going to be they're right distance that we're here. We can't go that low. I think it's -4 degrees.
-3 or 4 degrees.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
but I mean, the other thing you've got to bear in mind is that at very close range, shells will skip.
yes.
If you shoot at a flat trajectory, that's actually something they saw in the last few minutes of the action with Bismarck, where shells that were falling short were just skipping like stones. So even though the shells were optimized for underwater trajectory, once they actually got under there, as Jack pointed out, at that range, they're never going to get under there in the first place. They're just going to bounce.
Yeah, because basically, while the Washington was firing at some 8 kilometers, 8,000 something yards, the South Dakota was about 5,500 yards from the Japanese battleships. So she was even closer. It was really point blank range, and I would say that's another thing that we actually didn't mention with Washington's performance, that she seems to have been on that like kind of sweet distance spot, because the after action report reported something like 9 confirmed hits on the Kirishima, but the number of hits was arrived by basically counting shells that you fire and counting splashes. But from the Kirishima's actual damage, it would seem that a lot of the splashes were actually shots that went underwater, that didn't skip because it was already far enough. So they didn't skip, they hit underwater, and then the super heavy shells were kind of comparable to torpedo hits. So
She kind of got out Japanese there.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of it also comes down to the fact that, again, because he was acting as a complete professional, Admiral Lee did not want to overclaim his hits. So when he was compiling his report, he only wanted to claim hits where either he or an officer that he was questioning could say, yes, I definitely saw a massive impact and an explosion commensurate with us hitting them with a 16-inch Mark 8 shell. But as you point out, like a shell that goes underwater and detonates inside the ship, you're not going to see any detonation on the surface. And to be honest, even some of the hits that went in on above the waterline, they would hit the part of the ship that, well, none of the ship was armored against that kind of punishment at close range, but they'd hit some of the even less armored portions of the ship, and they'd punch really deep into the ship. They'd explode in there, but it would be so deep in the ship that you'd either not see anything or see very little. So it would be very difficult to visually tell, oh, that's a 16-inch hit. It might look, just the flash indicator might look like no different from a 5-inch hit that's detonating on the outer skin of the ship. And so Admiral Lee would only claim the ones he could very definitely say, yes, I know this was a 16-inch hit. But as you point out, in the Kiroshima's after-action reports, the crew were pretty aware they'd been hit by about 3 times as many.
Yes. Old Hammy Ham is asking in the Twitch chat, what are we looking at in this picture? I put this specifically because we were talking about the lucky barbette non-penetrating hit, because actually that was the second time in the 2 battles that this happened. This is not actually from South Dakota. I have to correct here. This is the base of probably the bombardment shell, the Sanshiki shell, that was found on the USS San Francisco after the first battle.
Oh.
And that also hit a turret barbette. In that case, it was a turret number 2. So there San Francisco definitely lucked out, because, that was a very kind of mixed blessing. I have a question or comment here about fire damage. So San Francisco went out of the battle basically with intact main battery and intact machinery, still afloat without any major damage, but she almost sunk because of the firefighting, because she was hit numerous times, including the bombardment shells, which were basically incendiary shrapnel. They spread a lot of tiny tubes filled with thermite over the target, so she was burning heavily. Actually, she was burning so heavily that the officer that was supposed to take command of her after Captain was killed did not take the command, because he felt that he's more useful doing the damage control. That was his main job. And at the same time, when transferring to Pacific, there were some modifications to the gunwales, and they included basically blocking some of the water outlets there. So during the firefighting, there was a lot of water gathering on the upper decks, which increases top weight, and it created quite a lot of stability problems in the end. So this is it was kind of mixed blessing. If this shell was AP, then the number 2 turret would definitely be gone. But on the other hand, the price to pay for that was more fires on board.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
I was gonna say, yeah, if you look at pictures after the fact, it's just the whole superstructure is just Swiss cheese, But yeah, if it, like you said, if it had any of those shells been actually AP and had penetrated, the armor belt or any of those barbettes, for sure,
Yes, this is the damage report of San Francisco, and you can see the sheer amount of hits. I mean, she also got to 2 kilometers of HEA, so it was even more point-blank combat than on the second night battle.
And South Dakota is basically in the same condition. All of her fire control systems are damaged or broken by the end of the engagement. So, but her main battery is intact, her armor belt is intact. She's able to sail away and be repaired, much as San Francisco was. So it's kind of it's 6 of one, half dozen of another. Yes, if you smother a ship in high explosive, shockingly enough, it kind of becomes very difficult to see or do anything other than firefight. So you've knocked it out of the battle, but you haven't knocked it out of the war. Whereas if you hit it with a lot of AP rounds, you can, well, actually, Kirishima is kind of the perfect counterpoint to that. She's hit by a bunch of AP rounds. She is doomed. She will sink. There isn't really any question about it after the 7 minutes of Washington unleashing on her. But because the AP rounds have gone in and done the deep underwater damage and not set huge numbers of fires, although she is quite happily ablaze by the end, Not quite to the same degree that South Dakota was, though. But Kirishima is still technically combat capable for the brief period she's still afloat. So she's still shooting until the engagement ceases. South Dakota obviously just can't shoot because she can't see. But at the end of the day, South Dakota comes back to fight another battle. Kirishima effectively just has a slightly more drawn-out death. So it shows some of the compromise you have to make when you're making these decisions about what rounds are we going to shoot at people, because what are you prioritizing at that point, and ultimately I think the AP rounds are obviously the better choice, because once the sun rises the next day, the Japanese are down one battle cruiser. The Americans are temporarily inconvenienced by one battleship. And most of South Dakota's crew are still alive, because most of them are closed up action stations in defended positions.
Yeah, that's actually one point that was also in Neptune's Inferno and in other books as well. That basically, one detail that is often overlooked is that if you have a surface action and main guns fire, the overpressure is not exactly pleasant. So usually when you have surface action, the anti-aircraft gun crews, at least around the main guns, are sent in shelter.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also what happened there. So you have more people protected under armor. So yeah. I have a question here from pre-registered ones from Senshi 71. This was picked by Dr. Clarke. And it's now stepping aside from the actually naval combat to the main objective of the entire exercise and the Henderson field. So the question is, could you please say just a little bit about the importance of the US Navy Seabees in the capture, repair, and maintenance of Henderson field, and what impact they may have had on the battle? Thank you.
Okay, well, to start with this, there is actually quite a good website which I found while doing some research for this, called cbcook.com, and it's got an article about the Seabees on Guadalcanal by Captain Larry G. De Veers, CEC, U.S. Naval Reserve, retired, which goes into it all. And I literally found I was hunting for names. The reason I was hunting for names was because I know the story, but I'm dyslexic, and me and names are sometimes things which have to be backed up and referenced. The Seabees on Guadalcanal are critical. And the reason they're critical is because they fulfill two roles. One, they actually pick up guns and start fighting on a few occasions to defend the field. But most importantly, every time the field gets attacked, it's supposed to be down. They build the field, and then they maintain the field, and they keep it going. And they are these wonderful damage control parties, these can-do people who will be found fixing aircraft at one point. They are fixing defensive positions. At one point, I think it was some of the Marines there were going, we need to dig some holes here, and working out how to dig a trench. And they're all sort of sitting there going, yes, we'll dig a trench. And one of the Seabees overhears and goes, don't worry. And then turns up, and they've brought their tractor over, and they just dig the trench. They were all the Marines are sort of looking and going, but we've got our shovels. We've got our trenching tools. That's not nice. Just turning up with your huge motorized shovel.
I guess the NCOs must have been the Marine NCOs has to be livid.
I'm fairly sure the Marine NCOs and the soldiers were actually laughing. It was possibly the officers going, but this is not the way in our manual. In our manual, we are supposed to be digging the trench with our spades. It's in the manual. Spades. So you cannot overstate. They are civil engineering corps officers. They are theoretically civilians, but not civilians, and each battalion contains 33 officers and 1,081 enlisted personnel. So that's one of the things you often have to think about when you're talking about the Seabees. They are not a small group of people turning up. If I'm not sure if America has the equivalent of it, but if in the UK we have this television program called DIY SOS, I'm not sure if there are many of them around the world. But basically, what happens is this bunch of presenters / builders turn up. They put a call. They've got a family who's got a house which has got problems. It's got a roof leaking or something like that, or they've got disabled children, etc. Or one of the members of the family has been trying to do DIY and is now dying or something like that, and they fix the house for them, make it suitable for their habitation, and just sit around their needs. And there's always this big scene where they show all the people who volunteer, because that's how they work. They put out a call on the radio station, all the builders and trades volunteer. And you see about 100 people have turned up. And you see how quickly this house gets done in 2 or 3 days, and it's amazing. Imagine what 1,000 construction workers turning up, given basically there are no health and safety regulations. There are no limits. You also have guns and alcohol. Do your best to fix it and get it done. Oh, and by the way, the quicker you get it done, the more likely you'll be safe, because the Japanese will be gunning for you shortly. It's amazing how much they construct and how quickly. Henderson Field comes into existence so quickly, the US Army is surprised by it. And then it's maintained and kept working.
Yeah, because basically when the Henderson Field was taken, it wasn't fully finished. There was several hundred meters actually in the middle of runway that are missing, which I find very baffling from the construction point of view.
So you start from both ends to work together, so you get there quickly. You don't want to start from the middle and work out. That's going to look weird. That looks like you don't like each other. Whereas if you work towards each other, you don't get to have a meeting ceremony. It's like the Channel Tunnel. You know, you have to have that meeting ceremony where you can shake hands and go, "Yay!" Or when you built the giant the railroad across across America, you have to have somewhere you can drive that spike into. And if you start from the center and work out, it just doesn't go the same.
Yeah. But basically, all they had was some equipment left behind by the Japanese, because the construction equipment actually did not get unloaded back in the beginning of August. But they just decided that screw it, let's build the thing. But they also
they hot rodded the Japanese equipment something chronic. Before we start sort of being rude about the Japanese equipment, some of this Japanese equipment magically follows this particular battalion around the rest of the war because they find it quite useful, and it gets put on their ships and it goes with them, and it turns up in places, and it's sort of a case of, but don't you have the American? We do. The American weapon is very good. But this has seen us through Guadalcanal and this and this and this. So, we know it's working. And it basically, it's some sort of weird Japanese-American hybrid vehicle. And you're almost wondering if they're going to new battles to find more spare parts that are Japanese origin to try and keep it going.
Yes. And they also get very proficient at fixing bomb damage. I believe their usual time for 250 kilogram bombs or 500 pound bombs by the end of the Guadalcanal campaign was something like 30 minutes. Crater in the runway, fill it, put a mat on it, and there you go.
There's actually a picture, if you go to that sort of website I just mentioned, there's actually a picture where they literally have the aircraft being taxiing and arranged behind them, and as the pickup truck has gone in, is tipping material into the hole, and there is another mat truck coming up behind it, and the aircraft are being arranged. They know it's basically being filled as the aircraft are being arranged to be flown off.
I was saying the Japanese destroyer squadrons took a habit on shelling on the Henderson Field sometimes too. So same kind of efficient repair, I believe.
But I mean with all respect to the Japanese destroyers, the 127mm shells were not that great at cratering the runways compared to the battleship guns, and especially compared to the 250 kilogram bombs. So
I mean, they tried it. They managed to get a few successful bombardments for Henderson Field in using Takao class heavy cruisers, and even the 8-inch shells didn't do all that much.
Yep. That's actually also a reason why they went for the incendiary shrapnel for the November bombardments, because that has a very good chance of actually destroying airplanes or fuel, because in the October bombardments the biggest immediate impact was that the ground crews managed to scrounge some flyable planes, but all the fuel burned down, so they had to siphon off fuel from damaged planes to get that first sortie out. So there was coming back to the sea, we have a question on YouTube from Frogfoot SU25. Okay, I understood the reference. How much more difficult would the Japanese win in the first battle be if the Americans had not been using TBS radio? I would first say that the first battle was not really a clear win for anyone. Like, I mean, the Japanese ships did deal out probably more damage than they received, but they did not fulfill their mission, and they lost the battleship, so it's kind of... but in any case, the TBS radio, I would say that Warsenal, it still was a positive influence for the American task force, because at least everybody knew that something is up. There were a lot of confusing messages, especially given that Admiral Callaghan didn't really share his battle plan ahead of battle, which I've actually did read an interesting speculation in the Learning War about why he didn't want to share his battle plan, because it appears that his battle plan might have been, frankly, very bonkers and workable, but not sounding very nice, because it was basically, we have to get within 10 kilometers of the battleships with cruisers. But
there is that sort of the pre-war thinking of the US Navy that if they could get within a certain range, they could overwhelm the Japanese ships, especially the Congos, because they were quite right in assessing that their armor had not been upgraded, that they were still battle cruisers.
That leads to quite a question that was asked for by Angel 287 to Drachinifel. Given that the range at which Hiroshima took fire from Washington, it's quite hard to imagine she would have survived even with her improved armor. But would the HIA in the first Battle of Guadalcanal, would the... let me... Given the range at which Hiroshima took fire from Washington, it's hard to imagine that she would have survived even with improved defenses. But what about the HIA? Would a better armor scheme would have saved her from the close 8-inch fire? Or was she doomed from the start because she was a battle cruiser?
It's possible, and I know where this question is coming from, is because one of the things I constantly rag on the Japanese Navy for is that I say that people call the Congo class fast battleships in World War II. I fundamentally disagree, in that when they upgraded them, they didn't take away any of the things that made them battle cruisers, they just made them faster. They made some minor armor improvements, but fundamentally they weren't any more survivable. Now, as it points out correctly, Hiroshima is doomed either way. It really doesn't matter. I mean, you could put Yamato up there, and to be honest, the only thing that would possibly save Yamato as opposed to Hiroshima if she was in exactly the same position would be the fact that Yamato has about twice as much displacement. So she can take more flooding before she goes down, because it's questionable as to whether even Yamato's 16-inch inclined plates would survive at that kind of close range. So yeah, whatever ship is there is definitely doomed. But with Hiei, at the ranges that the 8-inch shells are being pumped into her, the ones that are hitting at the waterline, the ones that are punching through the armor, the ones that are doing the damage that means she's gets the flooding that obviously it causes her to be slowed enough that she can be finished off by aircraft the next day. Some of those hits are at the bow and the stern. you're not going to armor those against close-range 8-inch gunfire. No battleship has that kind of protection. But amidships, there is an argument there that improved armor could have kept those shells out, because certainly there are a number of capital ships that you could substitute in at that point, and you could quite definitively say that their armor would reject incoming 8-inch fire, even at the relatively close ranges of that action. So if Hiei had been upgraded more along the lines of how I would have upgraded them, then she might well have survived. The question, of course, is depending on exactly what balance of speed, protection, and firepower the Japanese would go with in this alternate Congo class refit. She may not have been considered fast enough to go in there in the first place. If they wanted to keep the firepower but upgrade the armor, that would have had to come at the expense of speed. But they could have done other things. They could have upgraded the speed and the armor possibly at the expense of firepower, and then she would have been there. But it depends exactly how much additional armor they put on her, because putting 8-inch up to 9-inch probably is not going to help much. But if you can get 8-inch replaced with 11 or 12-inch, that probably help.
I do have an additional personal question about that and the resistance of the Japanese battlecruiser and battleship in general to HE fire. Is that the Pagoda superstructure actually looked way more filmy than the ones on US battleships? And so would it be actually more vulnerable to HE fire and the kind of bombardment from light units that the USN put through the first night battle? Was it a factor in the demise?
The Pagodas are more vulnerable in some ways, because anyone looks at them, they're a much bigger, much more obvious target. But generally, actually shooting at superstructures as relates to a ship's demise tends to be more about what you're destroying rather than the effect on the ship's ability to stay afloat, because that's where you've got your primary rangefinders, in some ships also your primary fire control, you've got the bridge, and various other command stations, and also the whole reason the Pagoda structure is there is it's not just the fire control, it's searchlights, it's secondary rangefinders, etc. There's all these command and control systems up there. If you shoot up the superstructure and knock those out, you dramatically lessen the ship's ability to be commanded and to fight back, which in turn means it's much more likely you're going to eventually kill the ship. Actually shooting up the superstructure generally doesn't actually contribute to the loss of the ship unless you get a spectacular end-to-end fire, but that's more about the whole superstructure, less about the bridge structure specifically. And in some ways I think the Pagoda, once you get to that point, the Pagoda structure might actually be a kind of perverse benefit, because it's lots of these little platforms all off a central structure. So if you're hitting it with really big explosive shells, you might actually be blowing chunks of it off, which lighten the ship and make it more stable because there's less of top weight. Whereas with the more pyramidal US superstructures, or the Queen Anne's mansions that the British were favouring, they're going to be substantially still there. So they'll just be very merrily on fire if you manage to hit them. But I'd say knock out a Pagoda superstructure with HE fire. Yes, it is a vulnerability, you're more likely to kill it, but it's because you'll be knocking out the command and control features, not because in and of itself it's going to compromise the ship's ability to stay upright.
We have a question from Wolfsweatpaws from NA server. That's also touching a often overlooked aspect of the naval combat. What effect did Reconnaissance have on the battle? What methods were employed, and which land/sea air units were involved? So that's actually how both sides came to clash on that day, because basically most of it was air recon, right? Discovering that that the other side the other guys were doing something somewhere. But how did it work in the Solomons? Where did the planes come from, actually?
Well, that's always an interesting thing because quite a lot of the reconnaissance is seaplanes, and quite a lot of the assets used are seaplanes. And some of those are from what we would call regular bases, and some of those are temporary bases where literally a depot ship would turn up and the seaplanes would fly in and they'd operate from a little inlet. And that's especially what the US Navy was trying to put forward. There's also submarines, which provide some of the information, some of the reconnaissance details by spotting things. And there's island watchers, which is more of an allied thing than it is a Japanese thing. But you would find these little parties stuck all over the place in there around Papua New Guinea, in Indonesia, and in the Solomon Islands. And you have, these, especially the smaller islands, the really tiny ones, the ones that definitely don't appear on that map. Definitely don't appear on it.
Yes.
Because they're just too small. You would have a little party sitting on them, and their whole thing was they had a radio and they had binoculars. And if you wandered past them with ships and they saw you, they would radio it in. So there are lots of different information sources going on. There's also American decryption of Japanese signals. There's Japanese decryption of American signals. There's a lot of information being gleaned from that. Both sides trying to read each other's mail, from both sides trying to monitor each other's signals. And it's one of the things that with the signal traffic, and one of the ideas we do get, is both sides seem to suddenly start to interpret Guadalcanal as being a more major push by the other side than they thought it was because of the growth in volumes of signals traffic. And both sides suddenly think, oh, this must have been an operation the other side was planning. Both sides have this idea that the other side was planning something and that they have managed to catch them off the hoof. And honestly, Guadalcanal, as we said at the beginning, is one of those battles which happens more by accident than probably anyone in high command would ever like to admit. In that it's the crossroads, it's where you go to get somewhere, and the Americans weren't expecting the Japanese to turn up because it's the end of their logistics trail, and the Japanese weren't expecting the Americans to really fight for it because why do you want Guadalcanal? It's about protecting the routes to Australia, etc. But it's not something that they expect America, which has lost the ships it has done, which has lost the stuff it has done already, to be really pushing a battle on at this point. So reconnaissance-wise, you are mainly looking at the PBY Catalinas from the Allied side. They are what are operating and what are being providing, especially the long-range reconnaissance. You also have some of the ship's float planes get involved, and the ship's float planes being used. Of course, South Dakota, as we mentioned, were on deck and were basically used as target bearing for the Japanese. But the reason they're there in the first place is because they need them for reconnaissance, and they were thinking about, well, usually what would happen with these aircraft is they'd be launched at dawn. Again, they would go up, and they might be launched just before dawn or at dawn itself, and would go up and then do a scout around and try and spot where the Japanese were. And all this information we fed in. And again, another problem you get sometimes with history, and you get sometimes with the analysis which comes through, is people presume that all the commanders have access to all the information. And actually, this is one of the things which Nimitz tries very hard to make sure isn't considered a factor when evaluating his commanders, because he might get a huge amount of information sent to him because all the strands basically end up with him, and he has a very large intelligence team sitting at Pearl Harbor, which is one of the cornerstones of World War II and the American efforts. And they can process a lot of information, and they can manage it and give him the reports. But if you're looking at the task force commanders and various ones, Gorman, etc., they don't have the same size teams. So they might get information. They will probably get the information from their own forces that they will recover. They might get them from Allied forces occasionally, but a lot of the information goes up and then can be sent down. But then it says it's a time delay because it's going up and then coming down. That's not going to be an immediate response. That's not going to be immediate information. So when you consider Lee and his movements, he's often making assessments based on the information he's received already, but that might not be the latest information that could theoretically be available somewhere in the American command. And he often fills that in with his own thinking. It's the same with Mitscher and to an extent Halsey, although Halsey tends to go more from gut instinct and just not worry what information's coming in. He's just going for it. Halsey is... There's a couple of admirals in World War II who I would like to do a video about someday of which was the most aggressive Allied admiral in World War II. And I think Halsey and a British admiral, who I won't name at the moment, basically tie for it, because if in doubt, both of them seem to be the true Spartans in that they don't ask how many the enemy are, they just ask where they are.
Yep. That's I actually ran through the timeline in the meantime, just to demonstrate, for example, how long did it generally take for the planes to get to the useful part of their search envelope. So on the 14th, the Guadalcanal planes took off at 7:15 in the morning to try to catch the bombardment group, and they reached the bombardment group about 1 hour 20 minutes later. So basically that's getting them to some about 150 to 200 miles from the airfield. So that's also the speed of information. Basically, you cannot get the information earlier than the planes get there. And another thing with regards to the signal intelligence, there's actually a lot of that was done even on the voice channels, and there were, for example, in the Second Battle of Guadalcanal, Lee had also some informations from the signal intercepts that the operators didn't understand Japanese, but they could basically tell that for one, multiple ships were in the area from the amount of traffic, and they were able to say that something is happening because the messages suddenly started to sound more urgent. So that's basically something you can get even if you don't understand the language. That's like... And Grey Coast on YouTube asked us to say hello to Drachinifel. So hello.
Hello. Yeah, I mean the other thing that's the other thing that you have to bear in mind in terms of the Guadalcanal campaign as a whole is that you also have Royal Australian Air Force reconnaissance assets, mostly Hudsons, doing long-range aerial recon. You also have the Coast Watchers, which are a bunch of, frankly, insane individuals, because at the best of times, we're going to put you behind enemy lines with relatively generous supplies of food and water and expect you to go and sit up the side of a volcano and watch for enemy shipping and radio in with, a trackable radio. That's not necessarily something most soldiers would volunteer for in the first place, but when they're going to put you behind Japanese lines in World War II, where they will probably behead you after torturing you if they catch you, it's not a job for the faint-hearted, unless you're exceptionally confident in your hide-and-seek skills. But it turns out that a good chunk of these Coast Watchers actually were incredibly good at that, and they kept a very good eye on the various passages and straits in and around the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal, which helped out an awful lot. There was also some incidental reconnaissance going on, because you'd have things like US Army Air Force B-17s doing high altitude flights, occasionally having strange ambitions about bombing from 20,000 feet on a moving target somehow being effective. But they tended to also have a fair number of gunners who got very bored during the overflights and tended to be looking for anything potentially exciting. So during the various incidents, there are occasions where a B-17 would come in with a report where they'd spotted something happening, which fed into the information chain quite usefully. So there's quite a lot of different assets floating and running around in the Guadalcanal area that are all contributing towards the overall recon picture. And to be honest, which one picks up which which bit of intel is kind of luck of the draw.
Yeah, and then there were also the submarines. That's actually the Kirishima's bombardment force for the second battle was spotted by 2 submarines. One even managed to get into firing position, but 3 cheers for the Bureau of Ordnance. 1 torpedo hit skirt, and torpedo didn't explode. So.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add on the B-17s. There was this is a thing I read. I think it was years ago. I think it was when I was visiting Duxford. It was on there. One of the things there that it was one of the displays they had for a special event at Duxford. They described how one B-17. I think it was during the Guadalcanal campaign, but I'm not 100% sure. Actually, the plane captain heard the ball turret starting firing and called down saying, "Where's the enemy fighter? Where's the enemy fighter?" And the gunner response was, "Not engaging a fighter, engaging battleship." You might as well. Probably as good as dropping a bomb from 25,000 feet.
Yeah,
I'm more likely to hit with a machine gun.
Probably, yeah. But the Allied scout planes also were getting, to my understanding, pretty aggressive. I guess you get bored on the long missions, so they were getting quite aggressive towards the Japanese scout planes. So there were actually some duels between the Catalinas and all sorts of planes, and obviously B-17s. That they were bad news for any plane slower than them. So. It was
a very interesting dogfight when you're in a reconnaissance aircraft and you've got a B-17 sneaking up on your tail, going, "I'm going to take you out." The guy looking behind you, going, "There is something wrong about this picture. You're not supposed to be dogfighting."
Yes, and what also helped probably to have the Coast Watchers network very effective that we mentioned was that basically it was initially it was organized from Australia, but as soon as the Guadalcanal was invaded, there was Martin Clements, Coast Watcher on Guadalcanal, was actually tasked with organizing and communicating with the Coast Watcher networks in the Solomons. So basically he knew exactly what the job is like and what can he expect, what can he ask, and how to interpret what. So that helped to improve the effectiveness of this network as well. Because
also a large number of the Coast Watchers were Australian and Dutch from the area who knew the area, and as we've talked about the hide and seek skills. Well, of course, Australians are well versed in avoiding emus, kangaroos, and all the various dangerous creatures which inhabit Australia. I'm not saying that just to wind up Jamie, our colleague from Build Farms. If you can avoid them, and so exactly avoiding human is actually quite easy. And we should probably think at some point about the Great Emu War, which I think Australia did technically lose.
Let's call it a draw.
Okay. But if you turn up with a machine gun and you run out of bullets before they run out of emus, then I think they might wiggle onto the wing.
Emu wave attacks. We have here a question that actually concerns the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, but also kind of events of the naval battles. It was picked by Drach, and it's from Rumbledog 001. Near the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese evacuated many soldiers by D-Day in the night. How many soldiers can a destroyer carry?
You'd be surprised. Quite a lot if they're prepared to ditch most of their kit and you're not going too far. Some destroyers were known to make it off with a couple of thousand men, which sounds ridiculous considering a battleship crew usually doesn't number that many. But as I say, you've got to remember, even a destroyer at this time period, especially a lot of the Japanese ones, they're displacing 1,800, 2,200, 2,200 tons, slightly more in some cases. They're several hundred feet long. and obviously they've got a fair bit of internal volume. These things are about the same size. Well, they're about the same displacement as probably a third-rate ship of the line in the Age of Sail, which could carry 600-700 crew in addition to many, many, many multi-ton guns. So when these destroyers are sent in to evacuate troops, bearing in mind they know that they're going in to evacuate troops, they're specifically leaving out certain components. I mean, when they were doing the supply runs, for example, at the Battle of Tassafaronga, a lot of the Japanese destroyers ditched their torpedo reloads. And bearing in mind, each torpedo weighs several tons. If you've dropped sort of 16 torpedoes off, you're talking probably anywhere between 50 and 100 tons of weight saved. Well, given that the average Japanese soldier probably weighs considerably less than 100 kilos, that's a lot of weight that you can take aboard. And men, unlike torpedoes and such like, can be, to a certain extent, put in places like corridors and holds and such, so you're not all stacking them up on the deck. You can keep them lower down in order to balance the ship out. So if you're in an absolute desperate scenario, maximum you can get a couple of thousand on a large destroyer. Usually it would be several hundred, because that will get fairly cramped, and you better hope that you're going to get home pretty quickly, because food and water and all those other things will become a concern. But given that most of these journeys are a day or two, if your choice is you get to stay on Guadalcanal and receive the kind attentions of the US Marines, or you have to put up with being in a somewhat cramped metal box for a couple of days, I think I know which one I'm choosing.
You see that at Dunkirk as well. You know, when people get desperate, I'll throw all my stuff in the water and I'll hop aboard this destroyer and, be uncomfortably close if it means getting off this beach. So no, absolutely.
Greece and Norway, it's repeated. It's a lesson which is repeated a lot in World War II.
Yeah, and you see this scaled up in all sorts of ships during the war. When you have evacuation transports, the bigger transports, you get cruise liners that were designed on paper to have a couple of hundred crew and maybe 500-600 passengers, are suddenly almost carrying divisions worth of men or more on them. The only slight problem with that is that if somebody does manage to hit one of these ships, you lose an awful lot of people very quickly. That's why, as Jack mentioned, at Dunkirk, you have the Laconia, not the Laconia. Laconia was in the Atlantic. I can't remember.
I know which ship you mean, but that wasn't in Dunkirk. It was in.
The Laconia incident took place in the Atlantic, which actually, ironically enough, was a bunch of Italian prisoners of war, which was a similar problem. But there was a British ship, converted liner that was.
I know exactly what ship you mean. That wasn't Dunkirk. That was Garonne. That was Western France. But
was it? Okay.
Yeah, damn it.
There was several thousand people went down with that, and then you have like the Wilhelm Gustloff at the end of the war as well, packed with a mixture of mostly civilians at that point. And you get some idea of, as Jack says, how desperate people will get, how many people you can squeeze on these things when one of them goes down, because it tends to take almost everybody with it.
Lancastria.
Lancaster, that's it. I knew it began with an L.
Yeah, Saint-Nazaire.
I was going to say, recently when we published the photo essay for the Operation Magic Carpet, you see U.S. Essex-class carriers, or just carriers in general, and you see the cots lined up end to end, top to bottom, with almost no room to get in, and how many thousands of men you can get into even the hangar spaces on an aircraft carrier, and then like Queen Mary, an ocean liner which holds 2,000 passengers at full load, is suddenly carrying 6,000 to 8,000 troops in a single go. So so to your point, you can really pack them in there.
I mean, it kind of came in handy on the 14th with the convoy battle, because while basically the entire convoy was lost eventually, only 2,000 soldiers made it to Guadalcanal. Most of the passengers of the convoy were actually picked up by the escorting destroyers that amounted to some 5,000 people. So even very suboptimal embarkation opportunities when you are getting off a burning ship on a destroyer that doesn't want to get burning. So yeah, you can. I mean, there's that old joke like how many men can fit into an army lorry. Always plus one, right?
Yeah.
Always one more. So it's the same with the ships.
Oh, man is not the problem. The problem is the supply that you will nourish them with.
Yeah, by the end of the campaign, Japan was trying some really desperate things, like actually making supply torpedoes that were, or not supply torpedoes, but basically wooden containers to be shot from torpedo tubes of the submarine to deliver rice, at least, to the island. But that did not work, and once the Allied control of the sea around the Guadalcanal was better, there were some epic night battles between New Zealand minesweepers and submarines, including one attempted boarding action, because was it with I-1 when she was rammed repeatedly by a New Zealand ship, and the navigator tried to get on board with a sword drone. So
yeah, Moa and Kiwi, a couple of the Japanese crew tried to board, including one with a katana. Turns out it's not necessarily such a wise idea. Although, to be fair, at the same time, poor old Moa, I think it was I-3, Moa very bravely tried to ram the sub, only to then discover that actually, because it was a big Japanese fleet sub, the sub outmassed it by a factor of about 3. So I think the minesweeper came off the worst for the ram attempt, but collectively actually managed to the two ships managed to eventually drive the sub ashore, which was somewhat weird because you like in most schools of submarine evasion tactics, the Japanese sub did everything right in that it tried to dive. The only problem they had in this particular case was, well, one, the New Zealand ships were equipped to deal with dived submarines with depth charges and such like, and two, as it turns out, when you examine the stats on paper, if they just stayed on the surface and fought it out in a gun duel, the Japanese sub actually had a heavier main battery than the 2 minesweepers did, which would have been a bit of a turn up for the books. But I suppose, fortunately for the minesweepers, it all went just a bit wrong for the Japanese sub. Which then led to a very interesting paradox, because over the next couple of weeks, both sides tried to destroy the beached sub with progressively hilarious increasing levels of failure. Because the Americans, the Allies wanted to get in and steal the code books and then destroy it so it couldn't be salvaged, and the Japanese wanted to destroy it so that the code books couldn't be taken off and be salvaged. But it turns out that once the submarine was actually beached, given that the normal method of destroying a submarine is to sink it, and you can't sink something that's beached, it proved remarkably resilient.
I believe that was the case also in 1944 with the USS Darter that got stuck on a rock after attacking the Japanese Central Force. And first the USS Dace tried to sink her with torpedoes, which didn't hit her, obviously, because of the rock. But they had to fire them anyway to fit all the crew on board. Then there was the USS Nautilus that was shelling her. There were also several attempts by the Japanese and by the American patrol planes to sink the submarine. That was like, I mean, from the point of view of the patrol plane, that was ideal target, right? Submarine, and it's not diving, so let's just try to bomb it. But the Melanie 16040 is asking, rammed repeatedly. To my understanding, it was because of the shore leave, right?
They rammed the sub repeatedly because basically they hit it once and, well, it didn't die. So, like, well, this isn't what's supposed to happen. We shall try it again and see if it works the second time.
You have to remember, these are the Royal New Zealand Navy. They are brought up through the Royal Navy. They have inherited the Royal Navy's love of ramming things. Come on, HMS Dreadnought, the only ship she actually kills in World War One is a submarine she rams. You know,
it's also something of a weird paradox going on, to be to be perfectly honest, because we've talked about the two night battles, the two night actions of the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, and we've mentioned Tassafaronga, we've mentioned Savo Island, all these absolutely vicious knockdown, drag out fights where you've got destroyers and cruisers and battleships and battle cruisers, and half of them aren't coming home. And then in the middle of all of this, a pair of minesweepers, each armed with a single 4-inch gun, just go randomly sailing around Guadalcanal. And apparently are doing this in the vague notion that they will somehow survive.
And
Yes.
they do.
Yeah, but I mean, Guadalcanal, the whole Guadalcanal campaign is full of interesting little paradoxes like that. I mean, even in the first night action of Guadalcanal, you have several US destroyers whose secret to survival is there appears to be a gigantic Japanese battle cruiser. I know I'm going to get really, really close to it, to the point we can shoot at it with our small arms, which is it's a refuge in audacity, because it turns out you can't. The battle cruiser is so big it can't depress its main guns low enough to kill them.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of another fun incident just before the beginning of the second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Admiral Lee force was almost attacked by the torpedo boats from Tulagi. That They didn't know that there are supposed to be American ships in there, so they saw big ships, so they readied the torpedoes. I mean,
He sends them a very nice radio message asking them please not to sink his battleships.
Yes. I mean, to be honest, with Mark 13s, it would be an odd chance whether they would work or not, but still, it would have been embarrassing, to say the least.
Yeah, it could have been annoying. But honestly, that's the thing of my own theory on why little sort of minesweepers survive is because they're such small fry and all the fight going on that everyone just ignores them. But the ramming of submarines, all the fights going on, is Guadalcanal is a mess. It is not. It's a battle which is rightly famous for all the actions which take place in it. But at no point can you say, really, either side comes with a coherent, grand strategy for what they're doing. They're both reacting to each other and to their perceptions of what each other is doing. Guadalcanal is one of those fights which it tells us more about the navies and the armies at a tactical level than it really does at a strategic level. Because if you go by both nations' sets of strategic thinking, Guadalcanal is the sort of place which both should have been just skipping past.
Yes.
Because let's be honest, if the Japanese had established a garrison there was no chance of them resupplying it. The Americans could have closed it off in seconds, and it would just be a case of, bye-bye, that's troops you can't use again. Which is what they did with lots of other islands. And for Japan, attacking Guadalcanal, that's not going to provide any security for you. You can't use that as part of your outer perimeter of your defensive screen, because it's just too far away from anything you've built up to support. Perhaps if you had launched the third wave at Pearl Harbor and had taken out sufficient infrastructure at Pearl Harbor to buy yourself an extra 6 months while the Americans had to rebuild the infrastructure at Pearl Harbor, then maybe in that time you could have built up the stuff that would have meant the infrastructure in the places you captured in the first wave anyway to support your operations in an outer defense perimeter at places like Guadalcanal. But they haven't. That hasn't happened. So Guadalcanal is, according to the strategy of both nations, it shouldn't be happening. But it is. And so you have the commanders, and I think I consider this also one of the troubles for the American admirals at the beginning. Gormley, there's him sitting there, he's almost thinking, well, I shouldn't be having to fight this. And in the end, you need someone like Halsey, or if you're British, you probably send in Vian or Somerville, who's just going to go, well, this might not be on the thing what I should be fighting, but they're here, and, well, we'll fight you. You're here. You're the enemy. I will fight you. Is the sort of, you don't want someone who's thinking, well, I need to save my ships because actually there's more important areas which I need to fight them. Because the trouble is, if the Japanese had one at Guadalcanal, then that's another problem for the US back home in terms of morale. And that's the problem. If you lose at Guadalcanal, you then have to explain to the public back home why you've lost. So the Americans have to win. And for the Japanese, once they've started fighting, they don't like to back down. They really don't in World War II, and that's one of their problems. They never know when. They only ever call it quits too late.
It didn't help that they consistently underestimated the strength of the American ground forces on the island. So basically,
Yeah. But there again, that would be again that's sort of in the idea of the world where the Japanese and the Army and Navy actually managed to talk to each other and actually managed to communicate honestly. Asking them to do that's asking for the moon and the stars and all the heavens in between. Just asking for them to work out when to quit, when it's time to quit, is hopefully aiming slightly lower than that. Maybe just geosynchronous orbit of satellites.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Well, I mean, we are already actually 2 hours and almost half into the stream, so I guess it will be slowly time to wind this down. Speculation. Guadalcanal isn't worth the effort to take, but both sides consider it worth the effort to deny it to the enemy and so fight. Kind of, yes.
Yeah,
I mean, initially the Americans wanted just Tulagi until they found out that there is an airfield being built on Guadalcanal. So that's
the rest of it is not worth having. What both sides want and don't want the other side to have is Henderson Field. You know, you could have erased every other part of Guadalcanal from the map and just had a tiny little atoll with Henderson Field stuck on it, and they still would have fought over it, because it's the capability of basing aircraft out of there to deny the sea to your opponent and to claim it securely for yourself. That's something around which a huge amount of the war in that area hangs, and you can actually see it during the entire campaign. Obviously, the Americans never lose control of Henderson Field, but it's why you have all these night actions, because once you've got a good chunk of strike aircraft and escort fighters based on Henderson Field, the Japanese Navy realizes they can't really afford to come down and play during the day unless they bring their carriers. And obviously those are depreciable assets. So all the surface actions are happening at night, because that's the only time the Japanese Navy feels they can safely operate. If the situation had been reversed and it was the Japanese who could safely operate at night and the Americans who are having to the Japanese can operate during the day and the Americans are the ones who have to come in only at night, it could have been a very different story.
I mean, look what happened at Midway.
Mm.
I mean, it's the same exact thing. We're fighting over this little atoll with an airstrip on it, and so I think the Japanese learned from that situation, and like you said, then you end up with all this nighttime fighting because we just can't do it. So no, absolutely.
Yep. We have here a question that was actually tying to the World of Warships. That's actually which of the in-game ships took part in the battle, and Maconiel did go through all the effort to list them. So
yeah, actually, Guadalcanal is very interesting. Is that a lot of different ships participated. You have the Congo class, 2 of them that are from World War One, but you also have like 5 different classes of Japanese destroyers. You have like 2 classes of American heavy cruisers, 2 classes of light cruisers. You have 6 different classes of destroyers too, and that is just all of the ships are in game actually. So on each side you had for the first night battle you had correct me if I'm wrong, but it was 13 ships on the IGN side and 12 on the USN, or was it the opposite? In any way, in the game, you can actually command the Hiei, that is a model of the Congo. You can command the Akatsuki, That will be the first squadron, composed of Akatsuki, Inazuma, and Ikazuchi. You have Amatsukaze and Yukikaze that are Kagero class, Teruzuki and Akizuki class, tier 8, Asakumo, that is Asashio class, and all the last destroyer being Shiratsuyu class, that is tier 7 Japanese destroyer. On the USN side, you can actually take part in battle into the New Orleans. So, is it the tier? Yes, that's the tier 8. No, that's not.
7.
That's the tier 7. Oh my gosh. And the Portland will be represented in game by the USS Indianapolis.
Yes, her
That is of
sister.
the same class. You have directly the Helena. And both Atlanta and Juno being Atlanta class, so tier 7 premium. Then you have a lot of different destroyers. If you really wanna play the Lafay, then it will be a Benson class, tier 8 destroyer. You have the Cushin as a Mahan, you have the Sterret as a Benham, and two of the ships are actually in the Pan-Asian destroyer as the USS Gleave, or
Gleaves, yeah.
Isenyang, I think, in the tree.
Oh, yeah.
Isenyang, yeah. I must say, though, that the Benson model we have in the game is not Guadalcanal accurate, as at the time of this battle, most of them were fit like the Glaive with 4x1 5-inch gun.
Yes.
And yeah. So you can see actually in destroyers, if you take in-game, the USN will be quite heavily advantaged if it was not for the torpedoes.
Yes. And also not for the doctrine, because that's another important thing where they differed, because that was also kind of fascinating from reading the Learning War, that basically the usual narrative is that the US Navy did not train for night battles and before the war. The things they did, but they trained for the wrong type of night battles. They went also in with the mindset of the decisive naval battle, and their idea was that basically the light units have to shoot their way past the Japanese screen and save their torpedoes for the battleships, while the Japanese doctrine was far more liberal with the use of torpedoes early on and basically not opening fire until the torpedoes are among the targets. So that's why the American destroyers at this point of the war generally didn't really get to launch their torpedoes effectively, because they opened fire at the first chance they can, and by that time the the target generally started maneuvering not to get hit, so they the torpedo hits were much harder. That's
anyone who actually can answer that, I have read in Neptune Inferno, I think, that Callaghan actually forbid his destroyers to fire the torpedoes at the target when they asked for it.
He did not forbid it going by the TBS logs. He just didn't get didn't give the order, which is kind of fitting with the doctrine. That's like
this is one of the problems that they solved as a result of Guadalcanal, where initially the doctrine going in is that you do not fire your torpedoes unless you're given explicit permission to do so. Whether that be your commander gives you a set of criteria that are fulfilled, or you ask permission, or he tells you to. Whereas after Guadalcanal, that's revised to effectively, not entirely free fire, but the next best thing, i.e. giving your destroyer captains a much more latitude to fire their torpedoes when an enemy presents itself. You have the same problem at Tassafaronga, where a bunch of the US destroyers say, look, we've got the Japanese destroyers in our sights, can we fire torpedoes? And Admiral Wright tells them, no, you can't. Which the destroyer captains are less than complimentary about.
Yeah, it must have been very frustrating for the destroyer captains even before, because with the previous commander of the Task Force 67, Admiral Kincaid, they generally had an understanding that if they ask him for a permission to launch torpedoes, they will get it and they will get the freedom to maneuver. But again, as in the previous cases, Admiral Wright was basically fresh to the command, didn't have time to properly talk things through with his captains, and so stuck to the doctrine that he knew, and that was it. That was the mistake, and that still took even most of the 1943 until the American admirals learned to give free hand to their destroyer squadrons. That's like if you compare the night battles at Guadalcanal in November 42 and the Empress Augusta Bay at November 43, that's completely different approach. That's
Twitch actually says that meanwhile in the game torpedo spam is real, but I must remind that in the second battle in the second night battle, when Washington, no, that was South Dakota, when South Dakota was actually spotted by the whole line of Japanese heavy ships, there were 34 torpedoes put in the water right at her, though apparently none hit.
Well, but the Washington also had to dodge quite a torpedo spam when the two of the destroyers escorting the convoy, actually, the Kagero and Oyashio, I believe, turned up to the party and went, "Oh, we see a battleship. We launch torpedoes."
And to answer a question of Tractor Inc., actually, were there some torpedo cruiser to take part in a battle? If you consider the Takao and their armament, well, they were not torpedo cruiser, but they were quite heavily armed with them. So,
Just a fun comment about the ship lineup actually in game. There's a lot of 6, 7, and 8, which would be which would be fair matchmaking, right? Except for the failed division Congos. So
well, that's quite true.
So I mean, it's history is stranger than fiction.
History actually did not balance.
It's the same with the opening of the second battle, right? You have the individual parts of the Japanese force split all over the place, and it must have been also very confusing for Kondo to make sense of the thing. That's actually one of the things that the Combat Information Center helped to solve a lot especially for not only for the captains, but especially for the admirals, that they had much easier time than to get information on where actually their ships are, because that's a large part of why probably Callaghan's and Abe's orders in the first Guadalcanal were so confused, because they just didn't know where anyone is and what status they are on. We mentioned the TBS, the Tactical Broadcast System radio, earlier, and the transcripts from the battle are really chilling, especially after 2:00 when basically when the battle was basically ending, and USS Helena is just sending a message like, "Hey, is anyone out there who hears me? Please respond." And that's that there is no response coming for 10 minutes. That's pretty telling about the impact of the battle. Anyway, I'm afraid we have to call it a day because it's already quite late. So for a quick parting words, I would actually ask everyone for their recommendation of a book for in general the battles around Guadalcanal and or night battles or anything related. So let's start with Makoniel.
Well, my personal recommendation would actually be Japanese Destroyer Captain, because it is one of the rare, even if at time inaccurate, one of the rare testimony from the Japanese side from a quite experienced captain. So it gives you a lot of information that are not readily available to US-based media. Though it is quite a commonly read book, but it is still quite worth a read. So
yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, that's been out. That's been out for a very long time, and that consistently does very well. I have to agree with you there on that one. Thank you.
Any other recommendation, Jack?
Well, I mean, as stated before, brand new book, which is of course Battleship Commander, about Admiral Lee. That's about his personal life though and his career. So obviously it's not going to all be about Guadalcanal. From us as well, you have the Struggle for Guadalcanal, which is by Samuel Eliot Morrison, which is a part of his larger Morrison series. That's always very good. But if you're also interested in learning more about, not necessarily since we're talking about the naval action around Guadalcanal, we have a brand new product line, which is a special edition series. So they're magazines, but they cover the land battle portion of Guadalcanal. So maybe, to answer some of the questions, well, why are all these ships circling this island, getting sunk all the time? What's going on in the jungle around Henderson Field and on this? So it shows you the other part, what the guys on the ground are doing while they're witnessing the carnage out at sea. So that's that'll be available soon too. So yeah, so some pretty good choices that are relatively new from us.
Yep. And Dr. Clarke?
Can I let Drachinifel go first? Because I have about 3 books and I'm just trying to find the 4th one in my pile.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I mean, the Pagoda and Jack kind of stole the march on several of my recommendations, but one or two of others would be Neptune's Inferno by the now sadly departed Jack Hornfisher. I particularly like it because, and I like generally naval history books that do this. It incorporates accounts from people who were there. So it's not just this happened, a very technical retelling, which is very useful. But it also includes observations, like direct quotes from interviews of people who were actually there at the time, which gives it a much more human element, gives you an idea of what they were actually seeing. And is, to be honest, it's a very comprehensive account of the Guadalcanal campaign in and of itself. The other thing that I would recommend is, get this the right way around, I believe it's Naval Military and Heritage Command's website. They have a number of reports that are either accessible on their website or as PDF downloads or both, which are some of the original action reports and after action write-ups conducted by the US Navy. Those can be very interesting as well, because obviously it contains a lot of very detailed blow by blow from either the ships or the commanders or what's been collated from the formation. But for some battles, it also, they can serve as a very good companion to a more modern, more comprehensive and more accurate account, like the ones we've been discussing, because obviously a lot of these were written at the time, within weeks or months of the engagement happening, so they don't have all the information. So it gives you a good idea of not what in hindsight we can look back and say, yes, well, we know X ships were sunk, Y ships were damaged on both sides. It gives you an idea of what the US Navy was actually thinking had happened at the time, and you can see which battles they had a pretty good handle on what had gone on, and which battles they were actually hilariously off the mark on, especially Tassafaronga. I'm sorry, but if you read the after action report for Tassafaronga, you'd think the US Navy had kind of fought a second midway. Not actually the case.
No. Okay. So, I
Yes.
have got 2 sets of books, okay, and they're pairs. So, if you want to know the Japanese ships, this is the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific War by Mark Style. It's excellent. It's an Osprey book, so I think you can buy them pretty much everywhere. I'm not sure who publishes them in America. I think it still might be Osprey, but it's an absolutely exceptional guide to the Imperial Japanese Navy. And this one, which hasn't got a more recent version and is possibly the best one of it, is Shokan, Hirohito's Samurai, the leaders of the Japanese Armed Forces 1926 to 1945, by Richard Fuller. It's excellent, and if you want to know about the Japanese admirals, you want to have their life stories, their histories, pretty much there is no other book like this. There are some books about individual admirals, but there is no other book I can think of on the Japanese side which actually covers all of them. And you can read all of them. Anyone who was a 1-star or higher, a brigadier or commodore or higher in the Japanese Navy or in the Imperial the Army, they are in this book. They're all in there. So these will give you a good idea of the Japanese side, what ships they had and who the people were in charge. Right. Because the Battle of Guadalcanal takes place, but it's also featured in, to an extent, the Battle of Santa Cruz. And that has a big impact on the Battle of Guadalcanal. And Task Force 58 is a really, really cool book about, I would argue, pretty much the naval air war in the Pacific. But if I was going to recommend you to buy this one, I have to go for a book as well, which is completely different, which is Taranto, which is the naval air war, which is by David Hobbs and is the naval air war in the Mediterranean. And the reason I would say you buy these books together is because if you want to understand the naval air war in World War II and what was going on and how it was going, if you put these two books together, it provides you a very interesting dichotomy of the development and the intelligence and the thinking through things. And it also shows you that the Royal Navy, the American Navy are confronting similar problems with sometimes similar solutions, sometimes different solutions, and why they're facing them, what they're facing them, and the tasks they're facing, why they evolve the way they do. And putting the two together provides you with an absolutely wonderful basis if you ever want to have an argument with anyone about naval aviation in World War II. Until my book eventually comes out, based on my PhD.
Okay.
And just a side note, both of those are available in the North American region from our website at usni.org.
I know.
And for me, it would be probably because there were a lot of interesting suggestions here. So I would mention the book that I mentioned already today a few times, Learning War, The Evolution of Fighting Doctrine in the US Navy, 1898 to 1945, by Trent Hone. It's a bit more technical, but it goes a lot also into the basically personal aspects, and you can follow the careers of a lot of the important players of the World War II decisions, starting already early on, especially in the Atlantic Fleet destroyer flotillas. That seemed to have been a kind of a breeding ground for a lot of experimentation and breeding ground for a lot of promising officers. And it goes both into this, it goes into the entire training setup, like the start of the Naval College, and then starts of various even impromptu training centers, like the CIC training center that was set up in Hawaii in 1942-1943, and it covers even the more technical aspects, like actually why for example, what we touched today, why radar didn't work as advertised necessarily, or what were the pitfalls, how were they solved, and so on. So it's a very interesting book as well, and it gives you a lot of very nice insights. Well,
I'll just sneak in there with one very cheeky quick
Yes.
one, which is, of course, that I have actually done a video series covering all the major battles of the Guadalcanal campaign, which even I think it's the only battle series that has its own playlist on my channel. So obviously I can't cover it in anywhere close to as much detail as the books we've recommended, so if you have plenty of time, I'd definitely recommend all of those books. But if you don't have as much time and you want to hear me being very sarcastic about some of the less competent decisions made on both sides, go watch those.
yes, definitely. Those are a very interesting series.
And as a quick note, because of Drek's videos with Trent Hone about Learning War, that Learning War will be coming out as a paperback in a few months, and the follow-up to Learning War by Trent Hone, which is Mastering the Art of Command, Admiral Chester Nimitz and the Victory in the Pacific, is coming out in fall of 2022. And the Guadalcanal Special Edition that I mentioned, the magazine, is also authored by Trent Hone. So for all you Trent Hone fans that are sitting here, that's going to be good as well.
Yeah,
Looking
and
forward to
since we have a few comments in the chat asking for the specifications of the books, I will just ask you guys to please drop the book references into our Discord channel, and I will share them on the forums with our viewers so that they know what to look for and where to look for. And also, apart from books, any relevant videos would be most welcome.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for stopping by. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I mean, it was longer than usual, but I think it was well worth it. It was very informative. I hope that the chat shares this opinion. Well, see you around. Oh, wait.
Bye, everyone.
Wait, just a question. Is there a SCP behind you?
Yes. SCP-682 experiment zone.
Oh, it's the reptile, right?
Yes.
Yes. Anyway, so yeah, thank you all, and have a nice time, and see you around. Thanks for coming, and enjoy your day, enjoy your night. And to the chat, thanks for coming over. I hope you had a good time with us. Hope you learned something today, or at least found something to argue about. And yeah, see you around. Watch our website for the information about the future installments. Thank you very much, and enjoy your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
And we are on